Welcome all to this Subject Overview and Scrutiny Committee 1 meeting, which has been convened as a hybrid meeting. The meeting is being recorded and will be available via the Council's website to be viewed subsequently. Everyone participating in the meeting will be accessing it either from the Council Chamber, here at Civic Offices, Angel Street, Bridgend, or from remote locations. Some of you may already be aware that I have a condition called adult onset epilepsy, which occasionally results in me experiencing short absences or mild seizures. On the rare occasions that this may happen in a meeting, you should not be alarmed, and should I as chair experience one of these absences or have any other technical ICT difficulties during the meeting, it has been agreed that Councillor Amanda Williams will step in temporarily as chair during the meeting, and in her absence, then Councillor Tim Thomas will step in. Please can everyone ensure that mobile phones are switched off or to silent mode. Members will have received an electronic copy of the agenda, and I will ask the officer to present a brief summary of the key points. For the record, the agenda can be viewed on the Council's website. Officers and members are reminded to refer to the page numbers contained in the public version of the agenda report pack. Members and officers will be speaking at various points during the meeting, and those speaking may switch their cameras on at that point. But I would ask that, with the exception of myself as chairperson, at all of the times you keep your cameras and microphones switched off, as this will help to minimise any background noise and interference. Whether attending in the chamber or remotely, if any members and officers wish to raise a point or question, they should click the raise hand icon at the top right-hand side of the Microsoft Teams window, and I will come to you in the order I receive requests. If you are in the chamber, please switch on the microphone on your desk and speak directly into the microphone to allow those who are remote to hear you clearly. Please lower your hand once you have finished speaking. The instant messaging chat button has been disabled for this meeting. Please do not use your microphone until I invite you to do so. Officers from Scrutiny will be supporting the meeting and will be monitoring the use of microphones throughout its duration, and where necessary will mute those not being used. I will ask officers to introduce themselves when I invite them to speak during the course of the meeting. They too should ensure microphones and cameras are switched off when not in use. I will now proceed to the agenda, and item 1 is apologies for absence. Rachel, Lucy, would you mind announcing the apologies for absence received? Or even Meryl. Welcome, Meryl.
Thank you, Chair. We've received apologies for absence from Councillor Jeff Tilsley, the Mayor, Councillor Martin Jones, Deputy Leader, Councillor Jane Gerby, and the Chief Executive, Mark Shepherd. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meryl. Are there any further apologies for absence? No, I can't see anyone indicating, so I will now move to item 2, and that's declarations of interest. If any member has an interest to declare in any matter on the agenda, please click on the raise hand icon and I will come to you in turn. Canon Edward Evans.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm not sure whether this is necessary, but I would declare an interest as a community governor of Bryn Comprehensive School. As we are discussing school budgets, I think that may be applicable.
Thank you very much. That has been recorded. Councillor Melanie Evans.
Thank you, Chair. I would also like to declare a personal interest, as I am a school governor for both Croisty Primary and Pencoed Comprehensive School.
Thank you very much, Councillor Evans. Councillor John Paul Blundell.
I'm sure Cabinet members can have declarations of interest as well, so I'll declare an interest as a community governor for Kevin Glass Infants. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Blundell. Councillor Richard Collins, please.
Thank you, Chair. Personal interest as community governor for St Mary's St Patrick's in Maesteg and LEA governor at Plasna with Maesteg. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Collins. Lindsay Morris, please.
Yeah, I'm a parent governor at Maesteg Comprehensive.
Thank you very much. Councillor Tim Thomas, please.
Thanks, Chair. I'm a community governor at Coleg Cymedol of Erwin and Bryn Menyn Primary.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Councillor Williams, please.
Williams.
Apologies,
Right,
there are
carry
far too
on.
many Williamses. Councillor Amanda Williams, please. Sorry, there's far too many Williamses.
Thanks. I think in scrutiny before we've been told we don't need to declare an interest if we're LEA governors, because by virtue of being LEA, everyone knows we're an LEA governor. However, as everyone else has said it, I don't want anyone trying to pull me up afterwards. I am LEA governor for Bryn Teg, and I'm also chair of governors, but it's LEA governor for Coity Primary. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Amanda Williams. Councillor Howell Williams, did you want to come in now?
Well, just what I've heard from Councillor Amanda Williams. I mean, I am an LEA governor of Abercurdine School, for everybody's information, but I probably don't need to declare that.
Okay, thank you. That has been recorded anyway. Does anyone else have a declaration of interest? Councillor Blundell, please.
As everyone's declaring their LEA governorships as well, I'll declare mine as the LEA governor of Bryn Teg Comprehensive. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Blundell. And I would like to declare a personal interest, as my partner is a secondary school teacher, but not in this local authority. But as we are discussing pay and other terms and conditions as part of this budget process, I thought that it would be appropriate for me to declare a personal interest. Okay, unless there are any other declarations of interest, we'll now move to item 3, the medium-term financial strategy 2023-24 to 2026-27. I will ask, I believe, Lindsay, are you presenting this report, or is Caris presenting you? You are, yeah. Okay, so I'll ask the Corporate Director for Education and Family Support, Lindsay Harvey, to introduce the report, and then I would like to ask the Chair and Vice Chair of the School Budget Forum for their views on the budget reductions against school delegated budgets for 2023-24 and the assumed budget reductions of 1% 2024-25 and thereafter. But first of all, welcome Lindsay. Lindsay Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. For the benefit of the recording, I'm Lindsay Harvey. I'm the Corporate Director of Education and Family Support for Bridgend County Borough Council. First of all, just to thank you, Chair. Scrutiny is obviously an extremely important part of the Directorate's business, and I'm hugely grateful for you all being here today to scrutinise my Directorate's medium-term financial strategy. And obviously, I very much welcome your questions and observations as part of that. I'm also grateful to you, Chair, for allowing me to provide a summary of the Directorate's strategy at the beginning of the meeting. So with your permission, Chair, I'm just going to run through some key items and obviously then discuss some of the implications with regard Council's largest directorate, with almost 4,000 full-time equivalent staff and a total revenue budget of around 176 million. The Directorate's revenue budget consists of 138 million of core funding and around 38 million of grant funding. The Directorate also manages a significant amount of capital funding, which I'll refer to later. The Directorate's priorities are as follows: the provision of excellent schools provided by effective support services, the development, implementation, monitoring of robust safeguarding procedures across all the Directorate service areas, excuse me, the development of ambitious school modernisation programme, the provision of a sector-leading early help service delivered by the right people at the right time to those most in need, the provision of effective youth support services, including an appropriate youth justice offer, the provision of an exciting post-16 learning offer to pupils and adults, the coordination of the Welsh and Education Strategic Plan to promote the Welsh language and Welsh medium education, the provision of outstanding support for children with additional learning needs, and the coordination of effective health and safety advice to all areas of council business. So, Chair, the Directorate comprises of 7 strategic areas. These are schools, as we'll be focusing on today, business support, family support, learner support, school support, support for vulnerable groups, and school modernisation. And within these service areas, there are 59 schools and 1 pupil referral unit. There are also 26 operational teams, which include, amongst others, the catering service, education psychology service, adult community learning, early help, edge of care, the Bridgend Youth Justice Service, and the corporate health and safety unit. The Directorate also manages the local authority school improvement function, which is procured via a service level agreement with Central South Consortium. The net budget for the Education and Family Support Directorate, including school delegated budgets for 22-23, is 138 million. Current projections indicate an overspend of around £800,000 at year end, and the main variances relate to an overspend in adult community learning due to a change in Welsh Government's grants terms and conditions, an underspend of £316,000 in family support, which relates mainly to staff vacancy management, an overspend of £1.2 million in respect of home to school transport, which is largely due to cost inflation, an overspend of £84,000 mainly in relation to increases in the cost of food with regard to the catering service, and an underspend of around £77,000 in relation to corporate health and safety, which is a result of recruitment challenges. The total funding to schools in 22-23 is around £110 million, and at the start of 22-23, projections indicated an overall surplus budget for school delegated budgets of some £3.473 million at year end. At Q3, this is reduced to a projected surplus of around £3 million. There are 7 primary schools and 1 secondary school. 14% of all schools are projecting a deficit budget at year end. In 23-24, the Council is proposing to spend £137 million on services delivered by the Education and Family Support Directorate. The majority of this money will be spent by Bridgend's 59 schools and 1 pupil referral unit. In addition to the £110 million proposed budget to be delegated to schools in 23-24, which mostly pays for the salaries of teaching and other school staff, the running costs of the facilities ongoing revenue expenditure. The Council has already spent £21.6 million in building and refurbishing schools as part of our 21st Century School Modernisation Programme. It's likely, Chair, that this will represent the most significant area of capital expenditure for the Council in future years. As far as budget pressures are concerned, 2 areas are being proposed: revenue to support the Council's school modernisation programme, totalling £818,000 over the financial years 24-26, and recurring pressure of £200,000 going forward to support the work of our Education Welfare Service to improve school attendance. For 23-24, it's proposed the schools identify efficiency savings of totalling 2% of their budget. However, it's important to note the schools will receive additional funding for a range of pay and price increases that should significantly outweigh this budget reduction. The forecast pressure on council budgets for future years is such that further efficiency savings of 1% per annum may be unavoidable for schools from 24-25 onwards, so it will be necessary for head teachers and governing bodies to plan ahead. The proposed cuts to schools' delegated budgets will be made at the highest level, that's the individual school's budget level, and not on an individual school basis. The 2% efficiency saving equates to £2.118 million across all schools, and by way of example, Chair, this reduction for individual schools would be as follows. A small primary school with around 100 pupils, that would be a budget cut of around £10,000. The medium primary school of around 260 pupils would be around £21,000. A large primary school would be around £34,000, and a large secondary school would be around £135,000. The above examples, obviously, Chair, are simple bottom line reductions, but unlike any budget areas, there are several other factors that can mitigate or worsen the effect of any budget cuts implemented for schools. These include pupil numbers, retrospective adjustments, rates evaluations, and grant income. Schools' projected balances have recently been updated to take into account the additional funding for pay awards, and the budget range for primary schools is between £119,000 deficit and £166,000 surplus. Special school balances are around 80k, and the range for secondary schools is between £13,000 deficit and £700,000 surplus. Hopefully, Chair, the information I provided will be useful to this committee, and as always, I'll be more than happy, and head teachers, colleagues attending, to answer any questions or offer any further information as required by you and the committee members. Thank you, Chair.
Many thanks, Lindsay, for taking us through that summary of the report so succinctly. Now, perhaps, as I mentioned, I can invite the Chair and the Vice Chair of the School Budget Forum to comment on some of the proposed budget reductions within the midterm financial strategy. So perhaps I can invite Hannah Castle and Neil Clode to comment on the impact of the school budget reduction proposals from their perspective. Who would like to go first? Hannah?
Good morning, Chair. Yes,
Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning to you all. And I'm sure that probably I anticipate that both Neil and myself will be sharing a similar message. But if I go first, I'm the secondary head teacher of Comfort Comprehensive School. I'm the chair of the School Budget Forum. And thank you for the opportunity for us to be able to just give some feedback on the budget reductions and the assumed budget reductions for the future years as well. Obviously, whilst I think it's best to preface this with a recognition that, yes, there is acknowledgement that there has been, as the director has just said, there has been, at this time of change, there has been support in terms of price increases and pay increases, and we acknowledge that, and we thank you for that. However, at the same time, I do need to communicate a grave concern about the budget cuts that are proposed. Obviously, the proposed cuts will, in simple terms, and go straight for the jugular really, will in simple terms, in many cases, result in workforce being cut in schools. Schools of my size, of around over 800 children, we will see a reduction, as you've just heard, of near 100,000, and that in real terms is staff. Those staff are employed by schools to cover some and to respond and compensate for the many cuts that we've experienced in central services over the last couple of years. So the staff that many schools have recruited will be key individuals that are supporting in terms of behaviour, speech and language support, attendance, well-being, because in many centralised areas we've seen cuts and schools have stepped in and propped up some of those reductions in the central services. With the proposed budget cuts, schools will unfortunately not be able to prop up as they have been, and the direct kind of domino effect of that is young people, because it'll be young people that aren't met at the gates in the morning with a reassuring individual who can bring them into school. It'll be young people whose attendance will not be able to be scrutinised to the degree and families supported to the level that they are because of the staff that we have in schools. So I'm trying to give you a picture, I suppose, of real terms of what this means. Our job, absolutely, as head teachers, is about young people. So I make no apology for being really quite blunt and saying to you that the impact of these proposed budget cuts will be on the young people of Bridgend. We do recognise, as I said earlier, that there has been support in some areas, but we also feel that it's important to say that, as the director has, with falling roles, with retrospective adjustments, some schools could be really considerably impacted by these cuts if all those combinations come into play. We will see that the director mentioned that the first kind of strategic area is for schools is about teaching and learning and progress and standards, and we will see an impact on those. And so I think it's important that I share that with you, because if these proposed and assumed budget reductions for the following years go ahead, we will see an impact in standards. And it's blunt, but I'm afraid that has to be said. I think that we recognise that schools at the moment, when the information was just shared with you, there was only one secondary school, for example, that was proposing and forecasting a deficit budget. I imagine that very shortly that picture will change. So we wanted to just communicate that and share that as well. We know it's tough times. We know it's really tough times for a lot of sectors, and we know that within education and within schools we're going to have to manage some of that. But we are really concerned about not just this year, but the cumulative effect and how we're going to be able to deliver and provide the services that we're proud of and that we want to, and the services that make a difference, and an education that makes a difference for young people. So I'm hoping that my message is getting across in terms of the kind of the gravity and the severity that we feel as schools, that the impact of these cuts. And I think Neil probably is going to echo and maybe add something different there as well.
Thank you, Hannah, for setting that out so eloquently. Can I invite Neil to make any additions and to that commentary from Hannah?
Yes, just to add to what Hannah has said. My name is Neil Clode. I'm head of Llangeffer Junior School. I'd like to thank you for inviting me here today. And thank you also for the opportunity to make a statement. We haven't had that opportunity previously, and it's much appreciated. It's my 7th year as head at Llangeffer Junior School. We have 41% of our children are eligible for free school meals. We have 350 pupils, 12 mainstream classes, 2 non-mainstream classes. And of the 48 primaries in Bridgend, we have the second highest number of children eligible for free school meals, and our budget allocation is much smaller than Hannah's. It's 1.45 million. the items I'd just like to touch on briefly are one, have we been protected in real terms to date over recent years? The impact of the central cuts, and Hannah has touched on this previously. The fairness and the manageability of these proposals, and the impact on Llangeffer Junior School in particular. So I guess we start from the premise that schools have been protected so far because we've had this kind of sword of Damocles hanging over us for quite some time now in terms of these efficiency savings, which of course aren't efficiency savings, they're budget cuts. And I think we need to think about this in real terms now, because in the 7 years that I've been head, we haven't had any inflationary increases to our budgets in that time. The cost of toilet paper, the cost of IT licenses, the cost of fencing, it's all gone up astronomically. I asked one of our agency suppliers, however, to provide me with some figures yesterday, because agency costs constitute such a large proportion of our budgets. And in February 2020, before lockdown occurred, it cost £159 to have a teacher for a day in school. Today now, if I were to have one in school, it's £192. That's a 20%, it's greater than a 20% cut. We haven't been protected against that, and we haven't been protected against it for quite some time. In terms of the cuts to Lindsay's team, well, of course, they've been astronomical and they've impacted us enormously as well. But we haven't had the privilege of being able to allow our service provision to reduce. So we've either met those costs internally or we've gone externally for the same service elsewhere. Again, we haven't had budget increases to allow us to meet those costs. And again, I just want us to think really that we haven't had this protection that I think people think that we have. In terms of our school, as I said, 41% of our children are eligible for free school meals. That means that the family income, including working credit, is plus working credit rather. Pounds out of my budget, which is what I'll have to do. What I'll have to do what I have to think about in all probability is either reducing or getting rid of perhaps 2 LSAs, or putting my deputy head. My deputy head is non-teaching at the moment, and her role, given the pastoral challenges that we have, is largely dedicated towards safeguarding issues. I understand the local authorities had a child practice review in the not too distant future, and it was the lack of soft information which was highlighted in that practice review. And if my deputy has to go back into class, then that is going to be exacerbated to a greater extent. Finally, I'd just like to talk about the fairness of the cuts. I personally don't think that the cuts are necessarily fair. I feel they're reasonably arbitrary. The settlement which was recently had was, I think, greater than the officers that the local authority were anticipating. But I fully understand that there are other budget pressures which have to be met. But regardless, I don't think we were expecting a 2% cut. And I think if we have an absolute cut, not just a real terms cut, then I think we really will struggle to meet both standards and the safeguarding demands that are placed on us statutorily. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you to you both for providing that sobering assessment of the impact of potential budget reductions on your schools and the schools which you represent on the School Budget Forum. Perhaps I can invite the Cabinet Member, Councillor Blundell, and the Corporate Director for Education to respond to some of your concerns, and then I'll open it out to members to ask any questions. Councillor Blundell first.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you to Neil and Hannah for that. It is important that we hear from heads and not just myself and Lindsay at these meetings, because they know what's best on the ground. I don't disagree with most of what Hannah and Neil have said. We are in very difficult times. Do we want to do a 2% cut? Absolutely not. I would personally, as sat here as the Cabinet Member for Education, as a governor of 2 schools, one of which is a feeder school to Neil's. Do I want to do a cut? Absolutely not. But I'm happy to hear options from the committee today on where we can find that £2.2 million. Do we raise council tax to near 3% higher to cover it, because that being towards what, or do we find the cuts in somewhere else? Neil mentioned the go into that in greater detail tomorrow. I believe it's tomorrow, stock 2. So we put more money into the child, but Neil is quite right. If schools cut maintenance, that means corporate landlord in budgets go up, as we've seen. We already have a backlog of work there. If we cut staff in school safeguarding, and that means we have more reviews and more referrals to our child referral unit here in the borough with Claire and Councillor Gebby. So I don't disagree, but I'm happy to listen to members' options today about where we should find that extra money, because I would happily give the money to the schools. Other councils across Wales are not even covering the pay and inflation. So, well, as Neil quite rightly says, it's 2 million here, but it's almost £7 million cut in others, because other authorities are telling their schools to find the money for the pay increase. So, again, that's all I wanted to say, Chair. I don't disagree. I'd love to give the money, as would Lindsay. We would happily give the money, but we are in dire straight times at this time. And that while the settlement was good, it wasn't brilliant, and it wasn't the be-all and end-all. But thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Bundle. And no doubt members and I will explore some of the issues which you've raised throughout the course of this meeting. Perhaps I'll invite Lindsay now to ask, and I'll just set this in a little bit of context, which perhaps you can explore in a little bit more detail, is how did you arrive at the figure of 2% in this forthcoming financial year and 1% thereafter? My assumption before Hannah and Neil provided their commentary on the impact of the budget reductions was that the 2% decrease in schools' delegated budgets would largely be found by efficiency savings, that there would be, I believe in the report you mentioned, minimum service level changes. That seems to be a contradiction from what Hannah and Neil referred to in their commentary, and that redundancies, at least compulsory redundancies, would be a final straw and kept to an absolute minimum. They've also mentioned the fact that they're fearful that a number of schools would be in deficit positions. So perhaps you can address some of the concerns which both Hannah and Neil have, and then I'll open it out to members to come in with their contributions. Thanks. Lindsay, please.
Thank you, Chair. And like you and the Cabinet member, just like to thank Neil and Hannah for very helpful feedback in this meeting. Hannah and Neil are very experienced, effective head teachers, and obviously they've collated advice from other head teachers and brought it here today. So I'm deeply grateful to both of them for doing that. The first question relates to how do we arrive at a 2%, and I think we anticipated that it was going to be a challenging year, and I think everyone did that across Wales. We looked at a range of potential cuts, efficiency savings. On the 22nd of November 2022, I discussed these with head teachers. We looked at 3 scenarios. We looked at a 1%, 2% and 5% budget cut to schools, and I alerted head teachers at that time to the prospect of these. The challenge would be, of course, is schools are a very large part of the council's budget. It's around 30% or more, actually, in some cases, of the delegated funding goes to schools. And I think clearly it's a huge part of my directorate. Now, all directorates across the council, you would have heard yesterday, Chair, in corporate overview, and certainly in other subject overview and scrutiny committees, that all directorates have been asked to identify efficiency savings across the board. Now, clearly, we don't want to put cuts in place that will impact significantly on service delivery. Is the last thing we want to do. But ultimately, we do need to balance the budget. And clearly, what we've needed to do is to identify areas where there could be efficiency savings made. Now, I think going back to Neil and Hannah's point, and again, part of the discussion around looking at where efficiency savings could be made, obviously I've worked closely with head teachers and especially the executive head teacher group, as Hannah will be aware, she's a member of it. And some of the other areas that they've identified have also been put into the mix and how we've thought about it. So schools have certainly seen increasing cross pressures, and I think that's something we've had to look at on a number of budget lines, not just staffing, of course, but energy costs and building costs across the board. So again, we've had to factor those into our thinking. We've also seen the increase in energy costs across the board, and the real inability really to forecast costs going forward. And this has been a concern that's been relayed by several head teachers. Increased staffing costs, that's a challenge because it's not always funded by Welsh Government in its entirety, and that's obviously increased budgetary pressure in some areas. And I think one of the challenges we've got is, as Neil and Hannah have already identified, schools are already modelling these potential efficiencies and how they will be reflected in possible staff losses. I think the other thing that heads have reported to me is they are now reviewing their class structure and class organisation, and this could lead in some cases, of course, where we have to remain within the guidelines to potential increases in class sizes. We've also looking at whether or not we can reduce the number in some cases of staff to support children in schools, and head teachers have reported that as being a challenge. And also where we've had, as Hannah mentioned, where schools have identified where additional support needs to be put in place with intervention programmes in schools, they might be reduced as a result of this efficiency saving. As Neil identified, I think some schools have identified that to meet some of these proposals, we would need to see a decrease in the amount of management time that's afforded senior leaders in schools, and obviously that's going to be challenging. So it impacts on a number of areas there, not just on management, but also the monitoring, coaching and mentoring role. That these are vital aspects of senior leaders in schools and the role they play. And I think the other thing which needs to be considered, and certainly something we've considered over the last year, is when we've been formulating these potential budget savings, is with regard to the availability of professional learning opportunities for staff, because obviously that would lessen the ability of staff to leave the school or free up time to attend these. So there's a significant amount of concern that's been identified. We've obviously considered these at some length. And clearly what we're trying to do, we're trying to arrive at a figure that we absolutely recognise it's challenging. We're trying to recognise that we do need to balance the overall council budget, and this is seen as a proposal of the contribution from my directorate to achieve that.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I'll now bring in some members to ask some questions. So first of all, Councillor Tim Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've spoken at length on the possible impact of the 2% cuts to schools. Members may recall from a previous scrutiny meeting I mentioned that I used to be a school governor, no longer at a primary school, Welsh medium primary school, and their budget was very much heavily well, most of their staffing costs made up the main costings for their budget, and the percentage I gave, the director said that is typical for most schools in the county borough. So and Mrs. Castle as well, she said that this is going to equate to job losses for teachers and staff. Members may also recall that there was a statistic which said the possible number of teaching staff that could be lost per secondary school and per primary school. Afraid, Chair, I haven't got that statistic to hand at the moment, but members may recall that. Perhaps Lindsay could remind us of that. And in a previous scrutiny session, I did challenge what impact that could have on children, because at the end of the day, we have the same number of statutory subjects. We have the same number of children that need looking after, pupils, I should say, that need looking after. And the response that was given to me was quite a fair response, was that we would share subjects between schools, and that would be done through online learning. And I've gone away and I've had a little think about that and what impact that could have on children. I don't mind using myself as an example here. I don't mind saying that, you know, I got quite high educational attainment, but in school I really struggled, and that was down to a very late diagnosis of dyslexia. And I have massive reservations of the impact that online learning could have on children with cognitive disorders, who are otherwise highly intelligent and very capable, but they may have those cognitive impairments that will severely disadvantage them. I cannot see children, for example, with ADHD being able to learn through online learning. In contrast, I mean, some children may flourish through their cognitive learning pathways using that medium, but I have reservations that this is going to impact children with additional learning needs, cognitive disorders, the low-waged single-parent families. So I'm just wondering, really, if that is the route we're going to go down, online learning, what impact does the director or the cabinet member, what impact does the director think that this will have on those groups that I've identified, and could there be any support? Because to be fair, I have praised this authority for the support through personal experience as a parent, the additional learning needs support that it's provided through the medium of Welsh, and I would be really sad to see that hard work undone through this. But thanks, Chair.
Many thanks for your contribution, Councillor Thomas. I'll ask Lindsay to respond now. Thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Thomas. Really helpful observations there. I'll just reflect upon the figure I provided previously. At a previous scrutiny meeting, I was asked to consider what impact the potential of significant cuts would have on schools. And I was asked to look at if schools were to lose teachers as a result of this, what would that mean? So I based my analysis at the time on a teacher near the top of the scale with on costs would be around £50,000. Now, obviously, it goes above or below that, but £50,000 seems like a reasonable estimate for that. So, for example, in a school of Hannah's size, if the cuts were going to be solely looked at in teaching terms, that would result in the losses of 2 teachers. However, I think it's important to point out, and I know that Neil and Hannah will be aware of this, is that we need to make sure that the 2% proposed reduction does not necessarily mean reductions in staffing. It could be mitigated by increased pupil numbers, as I mentioned earlier. There could be retrospective adjustments in place, and also, as I mentioned, the balances that are currently available brought forward. Changes in grant income will also affect this, but of course it could affect negatively and positively. And in addition to that, there could be examples of staff leaving or retiring. So again, it's not a very clear binary response here, because there's a number of factors clearly at play. The other point that Councillor Thomas quite rightly raises with regard to digital learning, and this again was a discussion in a previous scrutiny session, and it was in respect to post-16 learning, and I give the example and this is a combination of digital online learning and pupils attending different schools. So again, it is very successful in those areas. But I think the point that Councillor Thomas has raised, and I'm totally in agreement actually with this one, is how Councillor Thomas has recognised the value of specialist support required for children with additional learning needs. And I'm just grateful to Councillor Thomas for highlighting the success that we've made, certainly, and this has been recognised on a number of fronts with regard to accommodating the needs of learners with additional learning needs that want to continue their education through the medium of Welsh. So again, certainly thank you for that, Councillor Thomas. I agree with the observations, and again, as I've indicated, this is a complex piece.
Thank you, Lindsay. Just as a rider to that, you mentioned within your initial remarks following Hannah and Neil's contribution that you considered a 1%, 2% and 5% scenario. Now, you arrived at the figure of 2% to, I assume, shield other areas within the whole of the corporation, the whole of the local authority, for example, the pressures within adult and children's social services, which no doubt Scrutiny Committee 2 will discuss tomorrow. But what would a 1% cut look like, and what other options did you consider from within your directorate to, I suppose, to ensure that your contribution from your directorate met the corporate-wide budget cuts which we need to make? So a 1% budget cut would be just somewhere in the region of in excess of £1 million. Were there any other options you considered and then rejected within your directorate, which resulted in you arriving at the 2% figure? What I'm saying is to protect the vulnerable groups, which Councillor Thomas rightly refers to in his remarks. Did you consider any other options from within your directorate? And I'll bring in Councillor Williams and Councillor Evans. Lindsay, please. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, so a number of areas we looked at. I think just to give you some indication really, and I should have given this previously, of the delegated funding and what that means in percentage terms with regard to my directorate. So around 80% of all the money that comes into the directorate goes to schools. Now, of course, that's just the delegated funding figure. Now, when you look at the figures that actually support schools, it's way over 90%, as you can imagine, because that relates to things like homeschool transport, it relates to catering, it relates to education psychology, educational welfare officers. So clearly the whole range of support mechanisms that go towards schools, and that constitutes way over 90% of what comes in. Now, obviously, the directorate, as I indicated earlier, is a wide-ranging part. It also has areas that don't necessarily directly affect schools. Adult community learning is one of those. So clearly, we've got to look at it all. And I am part of a large organisation. As a directorate, we are committed to making sure the balanced budget, the budget balances across the domain, and clearly we've had to look at a range of efficiency savings. So just to answer the question directly, what have we looked at? We've looked at further reductions with regard to homeschool transport. That's an area we've looked at very carefully. But going back to Councillor Thomas's point, is that one of the key areas there was support in some cases, learners who come from areas that are not always served by ready homeschool transport, transport I should say. So obviously we've made sure that those learners are protected. We've also made sure that some of the more central provision for additional learning needs are protected and grown in some cases. So again, we thought from a school perspective that would not be a wise cut because that supports schools directly. Other areas have been very difficult to cut because obviously we had to meet statutory requirements on those. So we've cut significantly over a number of years, and we now have a decision where there are no significant savings to be made just to attain our statutory duties. So again, we look at it in the range, and those are some of the areas that we have looked at. Again, I think it's fair to say, and I think Hannah and Neil have recognised this, over many years there have been significant savings across the directorate, and now we're in a position where there are not many areas left to cut.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. And no doubt we'll return to this issue in the future discussion of this paper. But I'll come to Councillor Amanda Williams now.
Thanks very much. I know we had in our pre-meet, we agreed the structure for questions. So I will leave all those questions aside, even though they've been touched on here. But I have picked up, if you don't mind, first of all, a few questions as a result of our educational colleagues and what they've had to say and what Lindsay has said so far. And if I can also touch on my question about redundancies now as well, please. And then I will come back in when you instruct me to, as no doubt it's such an important topic that everyone else will want to have their piece on the committee. So I don't want to just keep firing questions now. As I said at the start, I'm Chair of Governors of Coity Primary School. So I wanted to start, first of all, looking at those schools that are new build schools or recently opened. And when you have a new school, you don't start breaking even until you have so many people in a class, which means you're always in a deficit. And we've got quite a few new schools in the local authority who have worked so hard for years to get out of that deficit and into a surplus. So there are a number of schools who have cut everything they can, tried to be as lean as possible, and are now in a surplus, a small surplus. And I think, first of all, the impact it will have on those schools to then be turned straight back into a deficit after all of that. I can't see where some of these schools can actually make any more cuts other than staff. And from that, we said that there's one school currently in deficit, but I'm interested in how many schools are COVID, and last year Welsh Government gave a number of grants to schools. Well, these grants, whilst they're showing as these schools are going to break even at the end of the year, they were earmarked for specific projects in the schools. They weren't for the running of those schools. So when they're spent on those projects, some of these schools might also turn back into a surplus. So I wanted to know how many schools will end up in a surplus with these cuts. I did the figures based on Coity's budget. It would be a cut of £32,668.86. So, you know, that's a member of staff. I'm looking where can the school make that saving when I mean, I've even offered a cake sale or washing cars outside the school to try and bring some money in, but we shouldn't be doing that. But on that, then there was the touch on deputy head teachers going back to the classroom. The deputy head in Coity, for example, is the safeguarding lead and the ALN lead. If they're suddenly having to give up that time to teach, what's happening to all our most vulnerable, and these are our most vulnerable children, our children with additional learning needs, and those who need safeguarding? I have concerns with that as well. And I don't think that's a valid suggestion of sending those people with responsibilities for those areas back into the classroom teaching, because we're going to end up, I think, in an even worse state than we are now, with the increase in referrals coming into the local authority. And then if I could just touch on, sorry, the redundancies, and I know it's been discussed, and I know I've discussed it with Lindsay, and I raised it in COSC yesterday, but you said about how much the redundancy would cost as a teacher going. What about if they're long-term members of staff who go for redundancy? Because I was told by the deputy leader yesterday, oh, well, we'll try and find them another job in the local authority. But if these are specific teaching roles and every school is making redundancies, there's not going to be another school to put that member of staff into. So where are we going to find suitable roles for these members of staff? And I would have thought that the long-term members of staff who are nearing retirement are those who are going to opt for redundancy. And with that, then could come an additional payout for that redundancy package because of the length of time served. And then we're in no better position. So I leave it for there, because you can bring me in on our agreed sections later, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. So, deficits, surpluses, support for vulnerable children and redundancies. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Williams. And first of all, just to thank Councillor Williams and everybody else who's part of this scrutiny panel for, if they are members of school governing bodies, for the important role they play. And again, I know there's been a lot of discussion within schools and governing bodies regarding budgets, and I'm grateful for your help. I'll try to cover off all the points. So first of all, with regard to the deficit and surplus budget position, close to break even. So again, we analyse all the schools' budgets on a monthly basis in conjunction with the finance team. I've alluded to the fact we are seeing 7 schools currently identifying deficit budgets. This is a large range, ranging over £100,000 to a small amount of the school budget. So again, using the figures I provided previously, Chair, looking at the average impact that's going to have on different schools, you can calculate how that's going to rest there. With some other schools, as I've also identified, there are significant surplus budgets that are being projected, and this will obviously support the schools with regard to any proposed efficiency savings. So the question really is, will the proposed 2% necessarily lead schools into deficit? That's not the case for the reasons I've alluded to, but Councillor Williams is absolutely right, is when you look at a school like Coity, which is a large primary school and is 30,000 plus in saving, that's going to be a very challenging position for the school governing body to manage. The other point that Councillor Williams raised, which I think is an important one as well, is with regard to new schools. And I'll use Coity Primary School because Councillor Williams has referred to that. They've done a remarkable job because, again, as a new school, Councillor Williams is right. For a number of years, it is difficult then to bring the budget back up into a surplus budget position, and Coity Primary School has certainly done that successfully. One of the things we are looking at with finance to look at our new schools as part of Band B is how we can change that to support schools more effectively when they are new schools. So again, Councillor Williams, that's something that's not been lost. We are considering it. Councillor Williams is also absolutely right with regard to the impact on senior managers and specific role they play, specifically with regard to the designated safeguarding lead and the ALN role. They are key responsibilities of schools, and inevitably is if these senior managers are going to move back more into teaching roles, that will impact on that, and that's something for this committee to discuss. I think the last point then is with regard to the redeployment of staff or redundancy. Councillor Williams is correct. If staff can't be redeployed, and we do try hard with schools to redeploy staff wherever possible, there could be redundancy costs there. A redundancy panel has been established as part of the local authorities' work with schools, and then any proposal from schools will be taken to that redundancy panel, and I would be more than happy then, following the first panel, which I believe is in March, to come back to scrutiny with any costs that's impacted. At the moment, Chair, I can't determine those costs because I don't know what's coming forward.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. Councillor Williams, are you content with that response? Probably not content, but are you happy with Lindsay's reply at the moment?
I am, yes, got some further points to raise the deficit and on redundancies, but I'll reserve those and let somebody else speak so that you can have a break from me.
Thank you very much, Councillor Williams. Thank you for your patience, Councillor Evans. I'll bring you in now.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Chair. Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Chair. My question will be around the medium-term financial strategy. We mention that we will be using a one council approach. Now, whilst I'm all for collaborative working, I fear that outsourcing and possibly tier building too many services could have a negative impact, contributing to the lack of joined up thinking and eventually not always producing the desired outcome. So my question would be, are you satisfied we are utilising our partners and organisations to their full potential?
Okay, thank you, Councillor Evans. Who would like to take that? Lindsay? Lindsay's best place to take that, so I'll direct that to Lindsay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Evans. Again, really important question, and we have to do that is the answer. I alluded to in the preamble to the presentation, I talked about the service level agreement we have, for example, with Central South Consortium. This constitutes around £550,000 a year. This is the commitment as part of the service level agreement to Central South, and that's a significant amount of money, obviously. Now, we do hold Central South Consortium to account, and as we've seen over the last 3 years, we've seen a cut in the money that goes to Central South as a result of the proposals that we've taken on board centrally to preserve some of this funding and obviously protect schools. So again, that's been cut over the last 3 years, and we're in discussions at the moment with regard to future arrangements with regard to the financial contribution to that area. With regard to other partners, we commission a range of partners, and I suppose the most clear example of it is home to school transport. We don't deliver that as an in-house service. This is contracted to a number of providers across the county borough. So again, that is a huge part of our budget, and it's something that we look at very, very carefully, mindful of the fact that a lot of the transport operators have incurred significant costs due to cost inflation over the last year or so. But that's something we keep a very close eye and monitor it very, very carefully. In addition to that, obviously, there are benefits of economies of scale, and one of the examples of this is where all schools currently contribute to a service level agreement through legal services, which is commissioned through the local authority, and that allows schools then to achieve savings without all schools individually contracting with a legal service. We do that on the school's behalf, and that obviously is a service that's well regarded and is cost effective. So really, to answer the question in 3 points: one, do we commission the external services? Yes. Secondly, do we hold them to account and analyse and scrutinise and squeeze every drop of value out of the services? We like to think we do. But going forward, and a key part of this committee's function is, again, I'm open to suggestions, because if there are areas that head teachers know, I'm very keen to hear from them, or for scrutiny members, that we can improve this and put better services in place that are more cost effective. I'm certainly all ears, Chair.
Thank you, Lindsay. Councillor Evans, are you content with that reply?
Sorry, Chair, I couldn't get my mic on then.
Okay.
Yes, I will have possibly further questions as we go through the meeting. But thank you for that.
Sure. The Education Directorate is peppered through the report, and it's, Hannah and Neil's contributions have generated a lot of discussion. But perhaps I can invite Hannah and Neil to comment on what has been said thus far. Of course, we as councillors have to be mindful of the whole of the local authority and corporation, and due to the pressures within adult and children's social services, it is the executive's view, the administration's view, that the protection of the education schools delegated budget now has to regrettably end. Perhaps I can ask you a question. What do you think is feasible? And I know it's tempting perhaps to say 0% or a budget freeze or a budget increase, but what do you and the School Budget Forum feel that would have been feasible in this financial year as a cut which would have been, I suppose, more desirable than the current proposal on the table? Neil, would you like to take this one?
Thank you, Chair. It's an extremely difficult question. I think it depends on the specific circumstances of individual schools. You asked previously how the 2% had been arrived at, and perhaps this question comes back to that. I think the process. I think we're a victim of the process. You get the budget settlement in December. I don't know what happens then. You know, maybe Lindsay's boss says to him, "You've got to find a 5% cut." In fairness to Lindsay, Lindsay's he's an extremely supportive director of education, extremely competent, and has been excellent throughout the pandemic. But he doesn't really have a choice. Where's he going to get the cuts from? You know, the rump of his costs that lie under him come from schools. Where else is he going to look? He can't find them elsewhere. If we were in industry, prior to coming into teaching, I worked for 15 years in industry as a chartered accountant. The process we would go through is we would look at those areas that had some fat in them, if you like. We'd look at those areas that had an opportunity for budget cuts. That process hasn't been gone through. I think it's an impossible process to go through, because you'd have to go through it for every individual school, and each individual school's position is clouded by the fact that they have grant income and they have specific challenges which they have to meet. So we're a victim of the process. Yeah, we have in Bridgend an enhanced provision for nursery children, which is the envy of other authorities, and really, it's something that you as a council should be extremely proud of, and it's something which, the impact on early years is, I believe, greater than any other provision out there, and you should be extremely proud of that. But from my point of view, you're asking me, what would be a palatable cut? Well, of course, I'm going to say it shouldn't be a cut. It should be an increase to budgets to meet the inflationary pressures which we've been suffering for all of these years. In terms of Llangewydd Junior School, there isn't anywhere really to cut other than the areas which I've discussed up to this point. So I don't know whether or not Hannah's got a better answer for you. I do apologise.
No, thank you very much for that. Hannah, would you like to intervene as well?
Well, I have no better answer, I'm afraid. It was a very tricky question for you to pose to us, I think, because we're going to say no cuts, understandably. Neil's right. There's circumstances, isn't it? It's depending on individual budgets, whether you're going to have a falling roll. That falling roll for secondary schools could come years 7 to 11. It could come post 16. So, we have two factors that we have to factor in there. And Neil is also right about the grants. We have the grants that make things very, very difficult for us and sometimes make our figures look a lot better than they are in reality. Because what you're talking about here today, I guess I would emphasise, is the delegated budget, not those grants. And you're looking at the cuts to the delegated budget. So I would really ask people to focus on that and bear that in mind, really. Yeah, I can't give a better answer than Neil, I'm afraid. No cuts.
Thanks. I know it was a tricky question. I'm good at tricky questions. I'll bring in the Cabinet member shortly, but perhaps just to add, this wasn't your commentary about it depends on individual schools is an interesting one from my perspective, because clearly some are in significant surplus positions, or not necessarily significant, but certainly surplus positions, and others are running at school deficits. And there is a risk, as you explained, of further schools falling into a deficit position as a result of the 2% budget cuts. Now, I was going to pose the question about whether, and this is probably impossible because of equality of opportunity, it has to be done across the board. But I was going to question the cabinet member and corporate director who are sitting opposite me on whether they could differentiate depending on different schools' individual circumstances. Now, potentially in some parts of the local authority, they have different challenges. Some maybe have a greater level of deprivation within their community. Perhaps others have other challenges of maybe more pupils with additional learning needs or other challenges which they have to address. So perhaps building upon what Neil and Hannah have said, Councillor Blundell and Lindsay, perhaps you can address that point. Is there any way in which we can differentiate based on individual schools' circumstances in terms of delivering what seems to be an inevitable budget cut? Councillor Blundell first, and then Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll answer that question, and then I'll talk about why I put my hand up. The simple answer is no, we can't differentiate. The more complicated and more nuanced answer is that areas of deprivation have changed dramatically since the cost of living crisis and even prior with austerity. Neil mentioned in his speech that he's got the second most free school meals in the county borough in Llangollen Juniors, which is in Cefn-Glas, which is mine and Councillor Harrison's ward. That wasn't the case 2 years ago. It isn't the number of free school meals, which we use as a deprivation figure in Wales and across the UK, has risen dramatically. So across all schools, I believe Hannah is the head of, who had the highest free school meals provision in the county borough. That has now changed as well, and it's now shot up into Maesteg. The areas of deprivation have changed dramatically. So for us for that piece of work, it would just, and I also don't think we can do it legally. Lindsay's nodding, so I'm right there. I just think it would be too complicated to do, really. But I understand why you make that point. And I've met with a head who has a small surplus and said, I won't be punished because I've got a surplus. And we're like, no, you won't be punished because we can't. And you won't get a further cut because you've got a surplus. It just so happens you have a surplus and some schools haven't. And that's not down to the individual schools per se. It's down to, as Hannah said, the fall in roll, changes in the locality. So it's very difficult to measure. But on the point to why I raised my hand, I just wanted to give a bit of an idea of how we sort of go about setting the budget. Contrary to belief, it doesn't start when we get our settlement in December. These meetings that myself and Lindsay have as an education directorate, as a cabinet, as a CCMB with Lindsay and his director colleagues, starts literally the day we become cabinet members. We're in meetings constantly going through everything. Now the budget has changed 3 times. Well, it's changed more than that, but it's changed dramatically 3 times because we've had 3 different prime ministers with 3 different economic models. Boris Johnson, we thought we might have a bit more money. I've forgotten. Liz Truss, we're going to have no money. And then Rishi Sunak will have a bit of money, but it's not going to be anywhere near what we probably would have had in the summer. So it is very difficult to set budgets in this time. And I think Neil is right. The process of which we have to go through now, and which we have had to go through for the last 13 years, is just, we are now getting to the point where we are now while we were at unpalatable choices last year, Chair, as you'll remember in our previous budget discussions as returning members, we're now at the really unpalatable ones. We've never had a cut in schools since we've been councillors, because the first 1% back in 2017 was done obviously the year before we got elected. We've never had to sit here and discuss percentage cuts into education funding. And that's where we're at now. And so these processes do take, we are working on them. We do try and go for every budget line to make sure that we can protect as many services like schools as much as possible. Like Lindsay said, we looked at home to school transport. We looked at where we could take more funding cuts in-house. But speaking of home to school transport, we have like 2 members of staff now who do home to school transport. So it is very difficult to make these choices now. And I understand the committee and Councillor Amanda Williams' point about the safeguarding concerns. They're where deputy heads go into school, go into classrooms now where they were non-teaching prior, is a valid one. But this is why we're here today. We want to hear members' views. We want to hear where the members think we can make those cuts in other places. But that's all I wanted to say. But thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Councillor Blundell. I'll bring in Lindsay now. I assume from following on from Neil's point, there's no fat to trim anymore. There aren't any efficiency savings to be made other than to cut schools' delegated budgets. I assume Councillor Blundell has already answered my point about differentiation. It's impossible, not legal.
Thanks, Chair. Councillor Blundell's right. We have a financial scheme for schools, obviously as published. Hannah and Neil, as Chair and Vice Chair of the School Budget Forum, they see that and obviously agree it as part of the process. We can't differentiate between schools. It's a standard formula in place. Obviously, schools receive different money depending on the size of the school and also depending on certain grants, for example, Pupil Development Grant. So there is differentiation with regard to the amount of money through grants, but it is a very set process. When schools, a question we often ask is when schools go into deficit, how do we help them? Now, we can't give them additional money. That's something that we are not permitted to do. But one thing we do, we look at them very closely with regard to the deficit recovery plans. This financial scheme for schools identifies a 3-year process. We can extend it to 5 years legally. That does help the school, and obviously work with them then and point them in the direction of certain grants. Indeed, I was with head teachers this morning. We were looking at really squeezing all the value out of available grants as well, which helps. But just to answer the question, no, we can't differentiate. I'm sorry, Chair.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, both Councillor Blundell and Lindsay. The conversation which has stemmed from Hannah and Neil's contribution has generated an animated discussion, but now we're going to return to our questioning, which we agreed before the meeting, if I may. And no doubt some of these issues will be explored in more detail as we go through the report. But first of all, we'll look at, we've looked at this somewhat already, but the budget narrative and corporate financial overview. That's pages 5 to 8, 3 to 5, and then 5 to 8 in your packs. Please raise your hand if you have anything to raise. But first of all, perhaps I can kick off by saying, by referring to some of the national legislative commitments which have been made by both the UK government and Welsh government, and to ensure that they're fully funded. I mentioned this in the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Committee yesterday, and I know that the leader, cabinet members, and other representatives lobby both central governments, UK and Welsh governments, to ensure that those commitments are fully funded. One particular or two pieces of law within your directorate which we need to ensure are fully funded are the Additional Learning Needs and Educational Tribunal Wales Act, and of course changes to public law for children. You mentioned in the report, or rather Caris mentions in her report, that not all schemes are fully funded, and for some the council does not have the capacity to deliver them in a timely and efficient manner. What is your opinion on that? How can we ensure that they're fully funded for the long term rather than just ensure that they're funded on a ad hoc basis for 1 year, and because that will just heap further pressure on already stretched local authority budgets? Do either of you, Councillor Blundell or Lindsay, have any comments on that particular point?
Yeah, I'll come in first, Chair, and Lindsay can add on any bits that I missed from an officer point of view. We do, as you say, we do lobby Welsh Government through the WLGA, and personally lobbying. Myself, I've written to the Minister numerous times. It's coming in May, and spoken to him on numerous occasions, and also through our members of the Senedd as well. That's the process we're going through. We do, whenever these new legislations come out, we always do remind, as my previous cabinet member, Charles Smith would have done, and as Lindsay and his predecessors would have done, always feed into the process when these legislative developments come through and say, well, we need the funding for them because they're brilliant, and we agree with them that these things should be in place, but we always do we need that funding, that extra funding, because otherwise they won't come to have the same outcomes that you expect. But I'll let Lindsay, because he'll have a little bit more on the detail of it. But on a high level point, that's what I wanted to say.
Great, thanks, Councillor Brundle. Lindsay, please.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of points really for me. First of all, we have received significant funding from date from Welsh Government. Clearly, certainly over the last 3 years, schools would be benefit of significant grant funding, as Hannah alluded to earlier. But the challenge will be, of course, is when that grant funding stops, as inevitably most grant funding does in the long term. It's then a challenge then to maintain some of those areas going forward. To give you 2 examples, really, Chair, which will help out. You referred to the ALNet Act. So this is to support the implementation of the new ALN Act going forward. Now, funding streams have been established, and they've been significant, and they've been obviously welcomed by the local authority and schools. But time will tell, really, as to whether these will meet the entirety of the cost. Hannah and Neil have just referred to the additional duties placed on ALNCOs in schools, and that's a challenging role. Whether or not all of those roles have been fully funded, I can't tell you, but we will certainly revisit that within a year or so of the cycle. Another challenge more recently that we've encountered, again, that has received and benefited from significant funding from Welsh Government, is with regard to the Universal Primary Free School Meal Initiative. The one challenge we've got here is with regard to some of the capital investment in this project. Not all of the money we've required as a local authority has been provided by Welsh Government, although there has been a significant amount that's been received to date. And of course, that will then impact on some of the challenges of delivering a very well welcomed initiative, but clearly this is something that's we're going to have to continue negotiations with Welsh Government to achieve additional grant funding wherever possible.
And obviously, it's the Welsh Government commitment to roll out free school meals to all primary schools by 2024, I believe, Councillor Brundle and Lindsay. I understand from the report that it says that the free schools meal entitlement would deliver funding, this is obviously nationally, £70 million in the first year and £90 million thereafter. Do we know what portion of funding that we get? I suppose we don't, given the fact that we don't know how many children would be entitled to it. Well, that was universal, isn't it? So do we have an idea of how much that would be? And would that be distributed as part of schools' delegated budgets for them to manage themselves, or would that be centrally funded from the local authority?
Thanks, Chair. It's a mixture. We do have additional funding, and we've got the exact figure, which I'm more than happy to provide, but I don't have it with me today, but I can check that. We get 2 funding streams. We have additional revenue funding and capital funding for obviously the improvements we need to make with regard to the school kitchens. But in addition to that, obviously there's a staffing element to this, because as we've seen, and certainly one of the pragmatic approaches that we've taken, is we might need to have more staff to deliver for more children. And that's something obviously we'll need to factor in. But what I can do, Chair, I can go back and speak to finance and our catering team, and I can get you the exact figures on that, because we have those from Welsh Government.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. I know that catering and staffing issues are significant budget pressure in your directorate. Councillor Amanda Williams, on this point?
Yes, please. Obviously, there's a number of consultations going through at the moment for expansions of primary schools. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up now is I know we've had rollout for reception at the moment for free school meals. Coity's take-up is 83.3%. So that's just in reception. So I worry that when we roll out free school meals, that not only will there be problems with staff, because if you imagine Coity at the moment, the most busiest days, there's 200 children who like a burger. Burger's the best day. So just about 200 children will go for school dinners. And when we're extended, we're looking at about 610 children. Well, 83.3% of that is 508 children. If 508 children want burger on burger day, how are we going to physically fit them all into the school halls as well? So I think there's a number of schools and there's costs that are not just going to come down to the equipment in kitchens, but whether each of our schools has halls that are big enough to feed all the children in as well as the staff in. So I just wanted to add that.
Wow, when's Burger Day? I might come myself. Does anyone have any comments? Councillor Brundle?
Yeah, no, Councillor Bennett-Williams, you're quite correct. There's a lot more logistics into this than just ovens and staff. Part of our discussions with Welsh Government is raising this. Our catering service team here in Bridgend raised these concerns straight from the off with Welsh Government. Some of the local authorities didn't, and now all the local authorities are on our board now who agree with us that there are these logistical issues. We are raising them with the Welsh Government about how we can better work on because as you say, it's not just about getting those pupils into the hall, it's also about dinner time, because feeding 500 odd children in a school, all on free school meals, does take an extra amount of time, and obviously we can't go into teaching time. So we are raising that with the Welsh Government about how we can best manage that going forward. But be assured that our catering service team with Louise Curtin and myself from a political level, we are having those conversations with Welsh Government. And I can also say our constituents, both our constituency member of the Senate, Sarah Murphy, has raised this as well numerous times with the Minister. So we are having those conversations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Brundle. Anything to add, Lindsay, at all? No. Okay. Thanks very much indeed. Councillor Williams, are you content with that reply?
Yes, thanks.
Thanks very much. Just one other thing from me before we move on to section 9, and that's the main section on education, and I know a number of members have questions on this. You mentioned on page 8, Lindsay, that the ongoing investment in installing energy efficiency measures to the council's buildings, including schools, will continue to offer significant savings in the future. When do you envisage that these are going to become a reality to offset some of the budget cuts which we may have to make throughout the period of the midterm financial strategy?
Thanks, Chair. A number of examples, really. First of all, we've been working with several schools with regard to the mitigating some of the risks on their energy costs. You'll be aware that we've worked with, I think it's 3 schools to date now to install solar panels, and that's certainly helped in those areas, and that's been a very collaborative approach with colleagues in Corporate Landlord and the Communities Directorate. We've also worked with schools with regard to batch buying energy, so there's something that's obviously mitigated some of the impact of this going forward. The challenge is going to be, though, I think, going forward immediately and in the long term. So I'll cover the immediate issues first. We don't know, quite frankly, we know exactly what these energy uplifts are going to be come for the next term. Now, we've undertaken quarterly reviews. Again, I've indicated this to head teachers at School Budget Forum last week, where we've undertaken a review in September, we undertook a review in December, and we've not seen significant uplifts due to the fact that we bought energy in advance. But going forward, obviously, that's going to be a real challenge for this local authority, so we need to think about doing things differently. That was part of our corporate management of our estate. We have looked at installing different saving measures or new windows across the board in a lot of schools, and also where we've identified issues with other fabric of the building. More recently, we were in a school in Connelly. Myself and Councillor Bundle, they reported some of the really good work the local authorities done has helped them with that. So I think it's a combination, Chair. I think it's a combination of some of the practical things that we can do, which we've done, some of the longer term processes we've done, for example, looking at greener energy, and also working very closely with schools when we look at new builds, so those new builds are built as efficiently as possible.
Great. Thank you very much, Lindsay, for that comprehensive answer. We now move to page 9, that's 4.1.3, and I know that Canon Edward Evans has a question on this. So I'll bring in Canon Edward Evans and then followed by Councillor Williams. Canon Evans? Thank you,
Chair. Yes, 2 points. In paragraph 4 on page 9, the council has a longer term goal to make the overall schools system more efficient. It talks about having the right number of school places available. It's just a general observation, really. There are plans throughout the borough, but particularly in the Bridgend area, for an increase in the number of houses. For example, as you know, I'm involved with Bryn Terrain Comprehensive School. There's talk of building 800 houses in the immediate vicinity of Bryn Terrain Comprehensive School. There's just general concern about where these children are going to go to school. Bryn Terrain is bursting at the seams, as you know. The local primary schools, Trelalis, Bryn Infants, Llangeffer Junior, Broadlands are all full. There's just a general thought of how it's anticipated in the immediate future that's going to be dealt with. But the second point I want to make, and perhaps more importantly, is in the last paragraph, you say the council is making minimal changes to the services delivered at this time. However, you're going to impose a 2% cut. Now, surely that is a contradiction. How can you maintain how can you make minimal changes to services with a 2% cut? It just doesn't add up. It doesn't tie up. To me, that's because it's a permanent cut. It's not just for this 1 year only. It's permanent, and it'll be exacerbated by further cuts in further years. So to me, that's a complete contradiction. How can you say you're going to make minimal changes and yet impose a 2% cut? So those are my observations on that particular page 4.13. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Canon Evans. Perhaps I'll pass this to Councillor Blundell, followed by Lindsay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Canon Evans. I'll do the school places one first, and the funding, especially for the 800 houses that the Reverend mentions in my area, or towards my area, I should say. It's not actually in my, and then I'll hand over to Lindsay for the services question, if you don't mind. So you're quite correct. How do we make sure that we have the right number of school places, especially when we have large housing developments? So number one, with every large housing development, there is what's called Section 106 monies, which come through, which we can use, which are earmarked for schools, like the housing development you mentioned there. There is a large proportion of Section 106 that earmarked for Bryn Comprehensive School. I can't unfortunately remember the figure off the top of my head, but also with a site that large would come with a primary school as well as funding for other primary schools in the local area if needs must, especially if it was a Welsh medium primary school that was decided to be built in the area. We'd obviously need to create places in English medium schools to help, especially in, one would say, Trelalis as being probably the closest primary school at that point. So we would work with that, and on that we estimate on how much space we can get with the money. Councillor Amanda Williams will know as well, as she worked on this in the previous term. But now we now can get even more money for out of housing developers to allow us to build extra classrooms, bring in extra teachers, whatever it is, so we can make sure that these children have school places. So that work is ongoing. We're obviously ongoing at the present moment in time with our next stage. We don't call them Plan B, a part of Ban B, of a school modernisation programme anymore. But we're currently undergoing the work on our next set of school modernisation, where we will look at where these new developments are coming in, where schools may need to expand, where they may need refurbishments in our classrooms. So that work is ongoing at the present moment in time, or indeed where someone might need a new school. So we are working at that at the moment. So that work is constantly ongoing with our 21st century modernisation team. So we are constantly updating that. But I'll hand over now to Lindsay, unless you want to add anything to this one, and then the services question that you raised. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Blundell. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Canon Evans. Thanks for the question. Councillor Blundell's right with regard to the school places. Just give you some figures with regard to surplus, first of all. Welsh Government set a guidance figure of around 10% surplus within local authorities, as they determine as being an appropriate level. Within our primary sector at the moment, it's around 10%, so it's in line with Welsh Government expectations. With regard to our secondary estate, it's around 18% surplus. But what we are seeing is quite interesting, because obviously we work very closely with planners. And what we are seeing, we're seeing the surplus position in primary growing, and we're seeing the surplus position in secondary decreasing, because as you see, these learners move through the county. Now again, when we see new developments coming in, obviously we see new families, and there's going to be a different age of learners potentially coming in. So we model that in line with the planning department. And clearly where we are seeing pressures in certain schools, we are looking then to provide additional facilities. So with regard, Council will have heard yesterday, with regard to some of the work we're doing in Bryn Comprehensive School and the capital investment we are proposing there. Clearly going forward, and again, a number of people who are on this scrutiny panel work very closely with us and planners on shaping the replacement local development plan. And as part of that, I know Councillor Amanda Williams has been very closely involved in this, is determining that when we build new schools, it benefits from a different set of planning guidelines. And this, again, will safeguard us going forward with pupil numbers in schools. So, of course, we work very closely with the planners on that. Moving on to the service delivery item, Councillor Evans, you are right. It is challenging, and when you do propose a cut, there's going to be some disturbance in the system, and we get that. The head teachers who are present here today, they've identified it. But one of the things you can certainly have my assurance on, and the head teachers will confirm this from their schools, whatever is eventually decided by council, we will make sure that we manage it very, very carefully, and we limit any impact with regard to service delivery within that. As we've identified, there are going to be changes potentially if these cuts go ahead, but it's for us then to work with schools and to make sure that any of these impacts are minimised wherever we can going forward. And again, you have my assurance we will certainly support schools very closely in that journey.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Canon Evans, would you like to come back?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I have no doubt that the Directorate will work closely with schools. They have done so. I've been involved with education in Bridgend for a very long time, and I've always been very impressed with the support that's given to schools by the Directorate, not only by Lindsay, but by his predecessors as well. So, yes, I'm sure that will continue, but that still doesn't mitigate the fact that there is this contradiction, that they are going to make minimal changes, a statement, minimal changes, but imposing a 2% cut. So I can't reconcile that, although I don't doubt for one moment that the Directorate will support schools as best they can. And then with regard to school places, yes, there is a 6 classroom build going on at Bryn Comprehensive School, but that isn't affecting the PAN number of the school. The PAN number is remaining the same. So that won't allow for any pupils coming from the 800 houses build. Perhaps it's time we looked at the PAN numbers of all our schools. And there are schools in the authority that do have surplus places, yes, but there are also schools in the authority which are bursting at the seams, as the Bryn being one of them. So it's a case of looking and making sure that PAN numbers are correct and or adjusted accordingly, and making sure that we can educate our pupils in the best way which we can. So thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak.
Thank you very much, Canon Evans. Do either of our representatives, Councillor Rundle or Lindsay, have any other further comments to make on this?
Thanks, Chair. Canon Evans is correct, and I agree with the concerns there. The one thing I will point out, of course, is when we see significant housing developments and when they are factored into the replacement LDP, one thing we do see is not just existing schools being developed, but in reality, what we see new schools being built, and obviously that will be part of discussions going forward.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. Councillor Amanda Williams, please.
Thanks very much. My points are on a similar vein to Canon Evans's. He touched on the PAN there, and I wanted to raise concerns as well with the PAN for some of our comprehensive schools. Some of these schools have been nowhere near their PAN for quite some time. Particularly the comprehensive schools that we've got in the borough. Most of them are larger, older, well, not most of them, we have got some newer ones now, but they're larger, older schools. You look at Bryn, where I'm also a governor, they haven't been near PAN for a long time. They're getting close now. I think their PAN is 330, and I think their roll this year was 308. And that's reliant on all the old porter cabins that they used to have. Well, some of those have gone, and you've got some old ones. So I think we need to also look at our existing, particularly comprehensive schools, and the availability of the classrooms. Because whilst the PAN is okay and we're not nearing it yet, like Canon Evans said about Bryn and the PAN isn't increasing with those 6 classrooms, is to be able to accommodate the children that are coming in there now. So it's looking at that and remembering that. But on page 9, it says the council has a long-term goal to make the overall school system more efficient, having the right number of school places available in the right parts. Now, Lindsay touched on the 10% surplus for primary. Now, firstly, I wondered, is that for the whole of the local authority, or is it in each area? Because my concern, and I'll raise first of all, because my name was raised twice there by Councillor Bundell and by Lindsay, that I was in a couple of years ago, I was on a working group through the planning committee to look at places and section 106 money, because we had the problem in Coity Primary where the school was built too small because we'd used old figures. And I was confident by the time we'd looked at that report that the figures now are a better reflection on the number of families moving into these housing estates. So any new schools, I mean, I'm not going to say it's going to be correct, please don't say that, but I'm more optimistic that any new schools should cover those coming into the area and moving in. However, I did all of that because Coity Primary was too small. Now, if you look at my area, Coity is too small, Litchard has no space, Coitchurch is at maximum, Brackler's at maximum. We're struggling at the moment, and yet we're turning away children. There are children from Coity going all over the borough. And I've been doing some work on the consultation, because I know Coity is one of the schools that's been expanded. And my concerns on this statement are that when we're looking at expansions of schools, we're still not getting it right with the right number of places. And it's something I raised in a recent consultation meeting, that the council have got projected figures going up to 2027 for all of these plans for their extensions. And yet I don't think we're still getting the figures right. When I looked at Coity, it said in January 2024, we're looking at 603 to potentially 652 children in Park Derwin who will require a primary space. And yet we're building a school to open in 2025 with only 610 places. And when I asked the question in COSC yesterday as to how can we make sure we're building all these extensions to the right size, I was told, well, you can't build a school bigger than the current number of children who are going into the school. And yet we're building Ysgol Bro Ogwl, who are on a falling roll, and in January 2027, the figures from BCBC say they'll have 356 to 369 children in this. We are building some schools bigger than at the moment to deal with potential future demand. So I wondered why there's a difference. Is there a difference between Welsh medium and English medium? And why, when we know the figures now, and we're pretty certain because there's a lot of work gone into this, aren't we building schools and extensions based on our projected figures, which will be correct before the schools even open, if you know what I mean? So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Councillor Williams. Lindsay, would you like to take that? Or?
I'll start, Chair, and then I'll bring Lindsay in. On your last point, Councillor Williams, you are correct. There is a difference between English medium and Welsh medium. English medium schools, we have to build them to, yes, there has to be 10% free capacity, but that is across the whole county borough. We can only really build them to the numbers that we have. We can't build them with numbers that we think may come, unfortunately. While in Welsh medium schools, we can build them with that extra space already built in. There is a difference with that. That's not a borough thing. It's a Welsh government requirement, not requirement, but sort of general rule, that you can build Welsh medium schools a lot bigger than needed, while English medium schools, you have to build them within certain numbers. You can't build them overly massive with loads of extra space. They just won't. Especially the other way we could do that is if we funded it solely ourselves, I believe, and we're not in the position to do that as a local authority. We need Welsh Government funding, and for that you have to go by Welsh Government rules. But I'll bring Lindsay in to talk a bit more about PAN and a little bit more detail for you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor Williams. yes, the 10% surplus for all of the local authority. Councillor Williams, you are right. You look at the pressures on places in certain schools, and we look at the arc really stemming from Richard, Coity, Brackler, Coitchurch. There's significant pressure in those schools, and we do know that. Going back to the new developments, really, the size of the school is obviously determined by the pupil yield rate as set out in SPG, the Supplementary Planning Guidance. As you know, Councillor Williams, the rates have recently been reviewed. These have been revised, and the increased rates now have been approved by Council, and these are adopted for new school bills. Now, Welsh Government will generally fund schemes where planning permission has been granted for housing developments, as I indicated earlier, and that's just to make sure that we achieve the appropriate size schools. One of the challenges we do find, and there's no legislation to protect this, is when a school opens, of course, is that when there are vacant places in school, anyone can apply for those schools, not just those learners within catchment, and that's obviously a challenge for new schools, especially in areas where they've got growing populations. The other thing, which obviously is a challenge for us, is obviously, as Councillor Blundell says, is that we can't control or reserve places for in-catchment, and this is a challenge. And again, we have frequent communications from parents who are frustrated by this, and I do absolutely understand their frustrations. And with regard to Welsh language, we do have a statutory requirement, all local authorities in Wales, to promote the Welsh language as part of Welsh Government's Cymraeg 2050. And one of the things we need to do is to build larger provisions for Welsh medium schools to encourage, wherever possible, learners to take up that offer. And indeed, it's funded by Welsh Government. So if we look, for example, something we took to Council yesterday with regard to the Welsh medium seedling school in Porthcawl, that's almost 100% funded, I think, by Welsh Government. So, clearly a benefit to the local authority. Councillor Williams touched upon the expansion of Coity Primary School, and again, I'm indebted to Councillor Williams and other members of the community for taking part in the consultation, which will run obviously from December. I think it closes on the 25th of January, and we'll go through the process then with regard to notifying Cabinet of the outcome of the consultation and seek permission then at that stage to move forward or not. So again, we'll be able to do that. And I think the last point, and I think this is something that is particularly important and where we look at for the future, is that we do try very, very hard, as I mentioned earlier, to work with planners to safeguard against future places. And as I mentioned earlier, Chairs, when housing developments are of a sufficient size, it invariably comes with a new school anyway. But again, we need to work very closely with all parties, including elected members, on making sure we get this right.
Thanks, Lindsay. Councillor Williams, would you like to come back on anything?
Not on that, because I'm dealing with that separately as well through the consultation process, all my concerns. Thanks.
Okay, perhaps I can intervene now and just return to the elephant in the room, which is the budget. And on page 9 in your narrative, Lindsay, you mention that the 2% cut in funding will largely be offset by pay increases and inflationary pressures. Obviously, we're all aware of the industrial action which is being taken by some unions, and this may result in an uplift in pay after the negotiations have taken place. Of course, it depends which government funds this hypothetical pay increase for teaching staff. However, perhaps you can explain what are the ramifications for this. Would it be a local authority responsibility to provide that uplift in pay, or would it be centrally funded? Furthermore, perhaps I can just build upon what Canon Evans mentioned regarding the perceived contradiction, and I have to say I agree with him with regards to protected investment in education. This cannot surely be feasible given the 2% cut in schools' delegated budgets. And from what Hannah and Neil have said, I don't want to put words into their mouth, but they seem to agree with that. Also, you mentioned that in part of the report that these savings, and I quote, may not be feasible. And within the report, you refer to the delivery risk of achieving these budget reductions as red, or at a very high risk of not being delivered. So this is going to be clearly a concern for members in setting a balanced budget. 88% of all council budget reduction proposals are in the red category. 8% are in the amber category, and 4% have been fully developed. So why are they listed as red? Why haven't they been fully developed? And perhaps you can explore some of the concerns which I had around potential pay increases as well. Thanks. Lindsay?
Thanks, Chair. So I'll cover off the pay one first, and it refers to in the report about the uncertainty really going forward. So you're quite right to highlight that, Chair. There is uncertainty because we don't know what it's going to look like going forward. Now, we have covered off the pay pressure this year. I believe it's around £5 million of additional funding. So again, it's a significant support for schools. And it's quite right, as it says in the report, is that then does mitigate some of the challenges that could be presented by the proposed 2% budget cut. So again, we are meeting it at the moment. What will happen in the future? Well, again, there are two key elements that we're looking at. One will be pay, but also cost inflation pressures such as energy, as alluded to in a previous response. So those two are unknown at present. And again, we should have more information shortly on that, but that's something we need to factor in going forward. As far as service delivery, obviously I covered off my response to that within Canon Evans's question earlier, but just to build on that really, obviously as I mentioned right at the very beginning, the Education and Family Support Directive is a very wide-ranging support. So schools are obviously a predominant part of that, but also there's a number of service areas that relate to providing support to schools. So that will seek really to cover some of those areas, which is obviously a benefit to schools. The last point you raise is with regard to the RAG, the risk rating as part of one of the appendices there. And you'll see the three areas that have been identified. The large one, obviously, with the schools, one around home to school transport and how that can be reconfigured under the responsibility of the pupil referral unit, and also home to school transport. So obviously the school one, I think, has been well discussed this morning, and the risks around that have been identified. And looking at it now, I think red is a fair risk on that because we have identified that there's going to be a significant impact. So again, schools have been very clear and articulate in their concerns. With regard to the other two, we talk about the reprofiling really of responsibility with transport to the pupil referral unit. We have discussed this obviously with the manager there. It's something that we think is achievable, but it's not easy. We've identified it as an amber risk, and that's something obviously we need to work out with them. But again, we're reasonably confident that can be achieved. The home to school, the home to college transport is a difficult one because, first of all, as you'll be aware, Chair, with all proposals of this nature, there is a lag. So as soon as we identify this and it goes through council as a policy, it certainly won't be achieved readily. It goes through a full public consultation. Inevitably, it will attract lots of feedback from the public, and we need to respond to that appropriately. So it certainly wouldn't be appropriate to identify that as an easy saving to make. And as I mentioned earlier, we are keen to preserve all possible ways to make sure learners don't become NEET, so they stay in education, training or employment. And we see this as being a facilitating factor to achieve that. So I think it's fair to say that all of the identified savings are challenging. And it's been a very, very difficult process to get to these. So again, I think red is a fair call on all of them.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. No doubt we'll return to discuss the budget pressures and budget reduction proposals in more detail when we discuss the appendices. Unless anyone's got anything further on the education narrative on page 9, we'll now move to pages 17 to 23, points 4.2 to 4.9 in your packs. That's going from the financial context all the way through to the midterm financial strategy. And I know that Councillor Amanda Williams has a question on this. Councillor Williams.
Thank you very much. My question was on page 21 and it was table 1 and it was the 795,000 overspend in education this year. I raised this yesterday as well. I know Councillor Blundell was observing, so he wasn't actually able to answer my question, so I brought it back to here. I asked, was the 2% also carried across the whole of the education department? And I think it was confirmed yesterday that it wasn't. It was just to schools. But my concern is, firstly, is this 2% cut to schools simply to plug the overspend elsewhere? And I wondered what the overspend was for, because if it also covers the additional work for ALN and safeguarding, because obviously the local authority does have certain obligations as well. If we're cutting that within our schools, will we see that budget and therefore the deficit in the whole of the Education Directorate increase as a result of the cut to schools, please?
Thanks, Councillor Williams. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor Williams. The overspend, or the projected overspend, has been identified in the 5 areas I referred to earlier. So they are part of community learning, staff vacancy within family support, obviously the significant ongoing pressures with regard to homeschool transport, cost inflation with regard to food in the catering service, and also vacancy management within the corporate health and safety unit. So all of these areas are obviously putting pressure on the overall budget. Councillor Williams is absolutely right, and I think Hannah referred to this earlier. Obviously, we are part of a connected ecosystem within education. So if we change one part of service delivery, it will obviously impact on another. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to preserve some of the key areas of support for schools. For example, attendance has been flagged up as a major concern with regard to schools at the moment, and we are looking towards a budget pressure relief on that to support education welfare, to support that particular area, and also maintaining some of the key provisions we put in place, as Councillor Thomas identified earlier, with regard to our LLCs in English medium and Welsh medium schools. So it is a complex arrangement. Obviously, it's one, as I mentioned earlier, is a sensitive ecosystem that we're very careful in how we propose changes. But again, what we are ultimately after is to minimise any impact negatively on schools and the learner ultimately.
Thanks, Lindsay. Councillor Williams, you content with that response?
I am. It links on to a question I've got on page 39, but I leave that for now. But I just wanted to also ask, if possible, when we're saying now about the schools going into deficit, now I get a finance report as my role of chair of governors and my role as a governor, which is a paper which shows a minus written on paper. And schools then can have up to a 5-year deficit recovery plan. But that is still a pot of money that's not accounted for somewhere. So how do we cover as a directorate that money? Because whilst it's a deficit, on paper it's a deficit, that money still has to be found somewhere from a pot to enable us to, for example, if I went into an overdraft at home, I couldn't have an unlimited overdraft. It's not on paper, it's real money. So where does that money come from then? How do we ensure we're covering the rest of the directorate if there are a number of schools in deficit?
Great, thanks, Councillor Williams. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Chair. Again, thanks, Councillor Williams. Interestingly, if I take you back years ago, we ended up with around 26 schools in deficit at that stage. And obviously the figure of deficit was significantly higher than where we are at the moment. Now, there's one legislative arrangement just to alert you to, and also the financial scheme for schools I mentioned earlier. So the 1988 Education Act obviously talks about local management of schools, and that delegates a range of responsibilities to governing bodies. And obviously we hold governing bodies to account, and both Eston and Welsh Government hold the local authority to account to make sure that all budgets within schools are managed effectively. So when we see multiple schools within deficit budget positions, obviously as part of a financial scheme for schools, it's a legal requirement to establish a recovery plan. We draw that up in conjunction with governing bodies and with finance. It needs to be signed off formally by the 2 statutory officers, myself as education and Caris now as the section 151 officer. So it's a very formal process, and how we monitor it and the governance around that is robust. that we try to get schools back into a positive budget position as soon as possible, because obviously during the time they are in deficit, there is a risk then to the overall directorate budget, which obviously I'm responsible for. So we work very closely with them to get them back into that position. Invariably, that's achieved, and certainly within the budget set in process, schools are very positive in the way they approach that. It's very difficult for schools when they are in deficit, because obviously they've got to manage the schools, they've got to make sure that they improve standards, because it's a statutory requirement, and also when schools are in significant budget difficulty, that does result occasionally in staff loss. So again, it is a challenging position. Interestingly, one of the challenges we've seen over the last few years, and I know a number of colleagues who are online at the moment will be aware of this, is budgets, but not so much in reduction in budgets from grants and co-funding, but co-funding is related to losses in pupil numbers, so as related earlier. So that's a very key one, and it goes back to something we mentioned earlier with regard to public admissions number. We try to make sure that we're very careful with those, so we don't see impacts on different schools when one pan is changed and another school didn't, as we saw in a secondary school very recently in Bridgend, and we try our best to stop that.
Okay, Councillor Williams, are you happy?
Sorry, my microphone wouldn't come off. Yes, okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Are there any further contributions on page 17 to 23, that's sections 4.2 to 4.9? I can't see any indication that anyone wants to intervene, so we'll move to 4.10 and 4.16. That's the commentary on council tax. I believe Councillor Williams would like to come in again on this, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, sorry, let me just find my question. I forgot about that one. I raised it yesterday, and I just said I would raise it today as well, because I think it's important, particularly for those who aren't on COSC. We're currently got an open consultation that's not been finalised yet. And so we're waiting on the public's opinion. We haven't got details yet of what the public want to see, what they believe should be, what their opinions are on a cut to education and a 6% tax increase. So I wondered, first of all, how are we going to show to them that we're taking on board their comments when we're having these discussions now and they haven't finalised the consultation? And do we have any idea of opinion at the moment so that we're able to look at our decisions? And again, I raised yesterday is about how we communicate with the public, because there'll be a lot of people out there who don't have children, who don't see that their council tax goes on educating our children in the borough. So it's how we communicate and make sure that all our residents know what their money is being spent on as well, please.
Thanks, Councillor Williams. I'll ask Councillor Blundell to intervene on this one.
Yeah, no, thank you very. It's a very pertinent question on both sides. How do we list? So once we have the consultation document in front of us, as a cabinet and a CMB, we'll sit down and sift through the responses to see what is the public want, as well as accepting the recommendations from this committee and others, and to see where we can, and also sitting down with Karis as our Chief Finance Officer to go through where we can make changes to the budget, what will need to come, what can come out, what can go, what has to go in, what. So there's a lot of moving parts to it. So we will be having those conversations before we present a full budget. I should say a full budget is presented to us as a cabinet and then presented to yourselves as a full council. On how we communicate, we are working on an aggressive communication package to not educate the members of the public, but just to alert them to what their council tax is spent on. Because as I raised earlier, about a 2% cut in education would require about a 3% rise in council tax, because we do 1% of our schools budget is more than 1% of our council tax. I bet not many people know that outside this building. So that's what we're working on at the moment, and that's something that Councillor Good is working, and Councillor Hal Williams is working with our comms team on, to make sure that we are alerting the public to this. on that. I don't know if Cara says anything she wants to add on the whole budget process from this point on. I think you asked also if we have any idea where we're at. I don't have any firm figures, but going on comments on Facebook, I've seen obviously sacking all councillors, but it's not obviously feasible. But we are sort of looking. I haven't got any figures for you today, but I don't think anyone's happy about a council tax rise. I think I can safely say that one. But I see Councillor Howell Williams has got his hand up, so I'll shut up now. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Blundell. I'll bring in the Cabinet Member for Finance, Councillor Howell Williams.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, thanks for the opportunity to make a contribution here. I am actually going to be leaving the meeting very shortly because I'm going to a public drop-in session which has been arranged. There's one at my stag and Porthcawl this afternoon, and there'll be one again in the Bridgend Life Centre tomorrow afternoon. I don't suppose I'm expecting the public to readily accept a 6% council tax rise. I mean, that's a given, that is. However, what we do want to know is what their priorities are, and are they prepared to, do they value the services as opposed to the council tax burden, I suppose, that they've been asked to face. We've had a very passionate defence of the school's budget this morning, and I'm certainly been listening to that, and I'm sure you'll get equally passionate defences of the community's budget and of the social services budget. And Cabinet members' job is not an easy one. I never pretended to be an easy one, but it's about balancing those pressures in all directorates. And the only balancing figure we have at the moment is council tax. And I'd be I'd be really keen to hear the recommendations from this committee, because you can protect schools by increasing the council tax burden, or you can reduce the pressures that we need to accept in the budget. So it's all a balancing act. I don't pretend it's going to be easy. It's a very, very difficult decision that we're going to have to make, and we are elected to take difficult decisions at the end of the day and to protect people. We've got our principles, and that is we will shield the most vulnerable, and that's where we're going to go. But in terms of the public consultation, I think it's very important that people do have their say, because I'm pretty confident that when we meet with people, they will understand that realization that you can't have the penny and the bun, not all the time anyway, and they will have to sort of value that service against a council tax rise. So I don't know if I've helped the situation there, but I'm just it is a very difficult job, but we must balance the budget. That is the key point, I think. We need to balance the budget. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Williams. And just before you go, perhaps I can ask you another question then. And I fully agree that we need to balance the budget. Now, I mentioned this yesterday, and you probably would have heard me mention this, but for the benefit of Scrutiny Committee 1 members, one category for the budget reduction proposals is identified as policy changes, and only 7% of which are identified as policy changes. Now, given the fact that nobody, I expect, would want to see a 6% increase in council tax in an ideal world, do you feel that only making 7% of policy changes is sufficient? Or do you think, as I mentioned yesterday, and I'll use the same words, and I'll use it in specific reference to the Education Directorate, do you think we need to be more radical in considering areas in which we provide a discretionary uplift in support beyond the statutory minimum service levels? While this, I know, might not be desirable because discretionary services inevitably play a role in preventing people from accessing statutory services, has this now become an absolute necessity to ensure that we do balance that budget? And do policy changes need to be considered beyond the 7% level which has been outlined in the report?
Thank you for that question, and I know you will note the leader's response yesterday, and I'm probably going to disappoint you because I'm not going to be that much different to what the leader said. You know, we are always reviewing our policy with a view to making the service more efficient. If we can sort of work with partners, and we've got a very good track record of working with partners. You know, I mean, our partnership with Halo is a good track record, I believe. Our partnership with Awen is a good track record. Our partnership with the shared regulatory services is a good track record. And so no, we are looking at policy change, and where we can do that sensibly and improve the service delivery, then certainly we will take that on board. Now, what you're asking me to do is to look at the discretionary element, and I absolutely get that. But conversely, when you look at that, quite often the discretionary element is there to protect people or to lessen the impact on statutory services. And so there really is a very difficult balancing act there. By taking away all of the discretionary element, then you can end up with a bigger problem in trying to satisfy the statutory element.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Williams. I did acknowledge that, as you know in my remarks, but perhaps now with specific reference to the Education and Family Support Directors, I can bring in Councillor Blundell and Lindsay to add specifics with regards to that particular policy area and where there is scope to look at different options for policy changes, because clearly we've been asked today to provide different options. If we disagree with the proposals on the table with regards to 2% cuts to delegated budgets, then we have to come up with some kind of alternative. So therefore, we need to have the options laid out for us to find those different policy proposals which we would like to see Cabinet consider. So I'll bring in Councillor Blundell now, and thank you, Councillor Williams, for your contribution.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Howell Williams. On non-discretionary and discretionary funding, it is a difficult balancing act. Policy-wise, we are, as Councillor Howell Williams, I'm sure the leader mentioned yesterday, we are always looking at them and reviewing them. Take home to school transport, for instance. We do run a very generous home to school transport policy. I know that some members may not like that because they don't all get the home to school transport for their residents when they think they should. But if we took that down as conversations you and I have had, Chair, offline as a member and the Cabinet member, that wouldn't go down very well either. You know, we are, when it comes to nursery provision, as Neil has mentioned, that we do offer above the statutory of 30 hours. Now, we could look at cutting that, but then we'd hurt our early years work and get that foundation years into place before they go into school. I met a parent at Pyle Primary who was shocked that we offer 30 hours because they don't in Neath Talbot, where she moved from. And she said, that's so helpful to me as a mom, as a working mom, because that means I don't have to have that weird switch over in half a day. Even the head of Pencoy Primary mentioned it to us when we went round, that he did the 30 hours here. He wished they had it in Cardiff because, you know, it helps with that change at the end of the day. So we can look at those if the committee is minded. Obviously, there will be a lag. I think we're 12-week consultation for home to school transport, and it'd probably be about a good 6-month consultation before we did nursery provision. But if the committee is minded to offer that as a recommendation, obviously I don't want to tell you what your recommendation should or shouldn't be. It's not my place. So if you're minded to have a look at that, we can, but there will be a lag, and there will be consequences further down the line, and it will hurt working parents, or it will, you know, be detrimental to those residents who currently get home to school transport who won't in the new policy. And then I'm sure my inbox will be full again of members asking why this parent doesn't get home to school transport when they should. But that's all I wanted to say on those two, because those are the two big ones for discretionary, non-discretionary in our directorate. But if Lindsay has any more, I'm sure he'll add on. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Blundell. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Chair. And Councillor Blundell is right. Nursery education, as you know, Chair, is non-statutory. It means it's not compulsory for parents to send their children to school and before the age of 5 or 5th birthday. Now, we do have a statutory requirement, as you know, Chair, for all local authorities in Wales to provide 10 hours of early years education, and all local authorities do that. But the offer in Bridgend is generous, and I think one of the things, as Neil just alluded to earlier, it's not just well thought of by parents, which it is very well thought of, but also by schools themselves, because we've seen real benefits as far as pedagogy and support for young learners in schools. So certainly that is the case in Bridgend. One of the things that we do see, of course, is that it being a discretionary provision, there are costs attached to it. It's not easy to extricate those costs, obviously, because it's built into primary school funding. And any change to that obviously would have implications, as we've discussed earlier, with regard to staffing. So again, it's not a clear-cut saving there in any shape or form. With regard to the home to school transport, again, we do have a generous home to school transport policy, but what we do see, and I mentioned this in previous scrutiny meetings, since the policy changed in September 2016, there's a tapering effect. So we see less and less sort of learners who achieve home to school transport above the Welsh Government expectation. So that's certainly diminishing, and we're seeing that year by year changing. We have consulted previously on home to school transport. We consulted in, I believe, 2013 and certainly 2018-19. Significant feedback from the public on that. Very clearly, they didn't want that altered, up in the 90% actually. So, and I attended 9 of those public consultations, and significant feedback. And you know, I've got the presentation in front of me I gave at the time, and there's a number of reasons why they felt it was important that we kept nursery and home to school transport, and it was impact on educational standards, costs of childcare, and the impact on the local economy. And also then for the longer term viability of older learners attending school. So all of these areas came back. So just to echo really what Councillor Blundell has said, 2 areas that are discretionary, because they're non-statutory, but you know, significantly well thought of by the public and schools.
Thanks for providing that context, Councillor Howell-Williams, Councillor Blundell, and to Lindsay. Okay, and Councillor Williams is indicating she'd like to intervene now.
Thanks very much. I've just got 2 points on the nursery provision and home to school transport, if possible, please. Firstly, the nursery provision. I think if you take that away, then all of those schools with nurseries in would achieve more than a 2% budget saving, because they'd have to make all those staff redundant, because, and you're not just talking about teachers, because you've got to have additional staff in there for the numbers. So by saying you reduce nursery, you probably fix the problem twofold, because you'd take that provision away and then all of those staff would go, which would be my concern. And also, given the fact that COVID now has recognised that all of those from those sorts of ages, being a governor in a primary school, we've noticed the children who have come into the system are far behind those who have had nursery provision. So that's a big concern there. And on the home to school issue, I've got to raise this because I raised it in COSC and I've raised it for many years. Lindsay, you weren't there. Mark, the chief executive, did pick it up and said he'd have a chat with you, but I think it'd be remiss of me, and I think you'd miss it if I didn't raise it with you, is the catchment areas and also the footpath networks into schools as well, because I've raised issues, I know in my ward, for example, where we're paying for school buses because there's not safe routes to school. And I always raise that in the one council element, and it's in this report today about one council is number of departments speaking together, and it doesn't always necessarily cost our authority money, because there are grants available, Welsh Government grants, because we have had some in Coity about safer routes to school and active travel, where we could be working with our highways colleagues in putting those footpaths into places and then taking away the need for buses, because there are children in Coity who can see Coity Primary but are bused to school because of the lack of a pavement. And likewise with catchments, when you build new schools, the old Coity school was in the village, and so we had part of Brackler in our catchment. And there are still children who are now being bused from Brackler to the new school because it's so much further away from Brackler. So I think we also need to look at catchments. And I know I've raised this time and time again, and we've had private meetings, Lindsay, as well, about catchments. It would reduce the reliance on buses in some occasions as well. And I think that needs to be looked at. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Williams. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor Williams. Absolutely, and just to confirm what Councillor Williams has said, we have met previously on this, and Mark did alert me to the discussion yesterday, and following the discussion, I picked it up with Quaco to look at the active routes, because I know, Councillor Williams, you have asked for this previously, and I've asked for an update yesterday on this, so hopefully I'll be able to provide you with an update on that soon. With regard to catchment areas, again, as I mentioned to you previously, this is something that we are looking at. In the first instance, we are considering Welsh medium catchment areas, and this has been something that's been identified by the statutory Welsh Education Forum that we're working with. So I know Councillor Bundle has asked us specifically to look at that, and then we'd look at catchment areas in the round, because clearly I'm with you, Councillor Williams. I think it could do with another look and a potential refresh, obviously, at the decision at Cabinet and Council. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. You content with that reply, Councillor Williams?
Yes, very content. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Councillor Evans, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, these are just my thoughts, but I do want them noted. I mean, we are in difficult times, and difficult times call for difficult decisions to be made. And unfortunately, sometimes those decisions can and will appear unpopular. We have an obligation to protect and deliver on our statutory services. Therefore, I believe we need to deliver and provide the best statutory services we can, and all non-statutory services should be considered. The public will be paying regardless, whether it's an increase in council tax, whether it's a cut in service, or whether it's a cost of childcare. So from my perspective, nothing should ever be off the table. We are in unprecedented times, and I do agree there are ways as well that we do need to look at catchment areas to alleviate some of these issues. And that's all I want to say on that.
Thank you, Councillor Evans. I think I'll bring in colleagues now, but I think you mentioned, Lindsay, that it was very difficult to extricate the data on exactly what discretionary services cost the local authority. Obviously, I've mentioned this in another forum about trying to get some data behind exactly what it costs for discretionary services. And of course, Councillor Gebbie and others have said about the merit and value of discretionary services in preventing people from having to access statutory services. That has also been rehearsed here today. But perhaps Councillor Blundell would like to address some of Councillor Evans's remarks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Evans, for those remarks. No, nothing is ever off the table. We are always reviewing what can and can. I think the point on, especially for home to school transport, and how really difficult it is to sort of calculate those costs is because primarily the bus, if say we took children off the bus or whatever it is, the bus still probably will run just with less children on it. And one of the comments I always get back from members is there's empty places on the bus. Yes, there is. And there may be just more empty places on the bus, so we don't know, but they might still cost us the same because we're still paying for the same bus. So it's rather difficult to work out, especially with home post-16 transport, because the bus still may run. It's just you will have less children on it, and then but it just have more empty spaces, and they may not go down because it's up to the provider whether or not they run a giant coach or they run a minibus. So that's why how complicated it is to sort of pull these together. I am aware that we are having a sort of a together meeting about home to school transport and how we review that going forwards. So I don't want to sort of mimic the work of that, and so obviously we're going to have those conversations then in greater detail. But just to say that it is just because they are slightly, especially with home to school transport, the bus still may run, but we don't know how much it costs. there'd just be more empty spaces on the bus. So it's why it's more difficult to make those savings and to make those calculations to give in front of you today. But I'll hand over to Lindsay if he has anything extra.
Thanks, Councillor Blundell. Lindsay, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, just totally agree with what Councillor Evans said. We absolutely should be committed to providing the best possible service. You know, that's what we're about. And I think a number of people have mentioned earlier is we are dealing with taxpayers' money. And, you know, we have a clear responsibility to do our very best for them. So totally agree with you, Councillor Evans. And we are looking, as Councillor Blundell said, at all service areas. We've looked at this at great granularity, actually, at team level, all the way down to individual service level. And wherever possible, that we've identified savings over many years now. Interestingly, the last time we did a review on this was just before our inspection in 2019, and from a central service provision, we run well below the national average on how much money is retained centrally. I suppose that doesn't change much over the last 3 years, so we deliver very lean services centrally, and obviously we tried our best to protect schools. The challenge is always for us is when you remove non-statutory services, as you know, Chair, it could end up with a significant impact on statutory services. I mentioned in particular our award-winning educare services. If you were to remove that, it's a non-statutory service, that could end up with significantly more impact on statutory services in children's social care. So again, we have to be very careful how we do that. Just build on what Councillor Blundell said with home to school transport. One of the reasons it is difficult to withdraw some of the actual elements of funding on this. Post-16 learners on buses, for example, they will benefit from that at the moment, although it's non-statutory. But again, those buses will still run. So if we remove the provision from them, it won't reduce our cost any, but it will stop those learners having that access. And I suppose the bit that we have been frustrated about over the last 2 years is due to the PSVAR regulations. Even when we've had empty places on buses, we are not allowed to offer those places on a commercial basis. So again, that's been very difficult to explain to some parents. Although we've had empty places, we can't offer them to parents, and that's been another challenge. And I think Councillor Amanda Williams mentioned earlier, the reason it's difficult to come to an absolute figure with regard to nursery is absolutely redundancy cost is one of the key issues, and also the impact it could have on wider staffing in the school. So hopefully that's helpful, Chair.
Thanks, Lindsay. I was just about to ask about pay in places. Actually, we've just answered the question. We'll... Councillor Evans, did you want to come back? Sorry, you saw your hand up then.
I was going to ask about post-16 pay-in places actually on a bus, because when you consider that in other authorities, you know, post-16 do not get free transport to school, you know, and as I said, we are in unprecedented times. If you were to take up sort of like different courses in different places, then actually those learners do generally make their own way to school. And I wonder then if there could be a policy review in looking at that fact that on post-16 workers, learners could actually pay for their place should that bus continue to run.
Councillor Blundell?
Yeah, it would go back to the PSVAR requirements that Lindsay alluded to, that we at the present moment in time we can't offer paid places because those buses don't meet those requirements, and for us to do so would require us to work with to require a lot of capital investment to help those companies, because there just aren't any of those companies available in the Bridgend County area, and we always try to use Bridgend companies to help us on our carbon net zero 2030 agenda. So for us to go offer, so we'd have to entice those companies with capital investment, unfortunately. But as I said, we're going to have the home to school transport review, so we'll have those wider discussions on that day and therefore after. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks for confirming that that review will take place in due course. I'm going to move on now, if that's okay, members. We're well over 2 hours into our discussion, and we need to come to some conclusions and recommendations. So I'd like to move on to page 23 to 30 now, and that's the MTFS resource envelope all the way through to non-teachers' pensions, taking into account table 4, 5, 6 and 7. We've already covered some of these items off, including the risk status of the budget reduction proposals and other budget reduction proposals which have been identified. So I don't know whether anyone else has anything else to add at the moment, or whether we can go straight to the appendices and discuss budget pressures and budget reduction proposals. If anyone has anything on Pages 23 to 30, 30 to 31, please raise your hand now. Okay, on that basis, we'll move to Appendix A, which is listed on page 39 of the public pack. EFS 1, that is revenue to support the annual service payments for the school modernisation programme band B. Anyone have a question on that? Councillor Williams, I think yours is on EFS 2, is that correct?
Yeah, I was just going to say, sorry.
Yeah, come in on EFS 2, no problem.
Great, thanks. It was just simply on the 200k budget pressure in the directorate. And I wondered, sorry, I'm just flicking through to my page as well. I wondered what impact that will also have, because if you've seen it within the directorate, schools are also seeing it as well, the need for all these additional services. Some schools have employed social workers to deal with these issues. And so, of course, if we're cutting their budgets by 2%, will this mean that they now lose those social workers? And because safeguarding incidents and behaviour has been a massive problem, particularly since COVID. And then if they are having to lose those positions, will that impact on the amount of money that's required for the authority as well?
Thanks, Councillor Williams. Who'd like to take that? Lindsay?
Thanks, Councillor Williams. If I've understood the question, with regard to EFSS 2, that's with regard to additional support for attendance in schools. So obviously this will be directly impacting and working very closely with schools on this. Members will be aware, because again, in a previous meeting of this committee, we talked about some of the challenges that schools have had on attendance. And traditionally, Bridgend has done very well. Our schools generally in the top quartile with regard to attendance. What we have seen, certainly since the pandemic, is enormous difficulties within this. This has been reflected across Wales. But of course, what we're trying to do is trying to make sure that we get back up to those position of being in that top quartile again. And one of the things that we have seen, we've run quite a small education welfare service over a number of years. Head teachers have come to us and said, look, attendance is a real issue. We do need to get more support in this area. So what we are proposing by this budget pressure is that we get more support in there directly into schools and making sure wherever possible learners, where they are fit and well enough to do so, they attend schools. So this should be a really positive outcome for schools.
Thanks, Lindsay. And why is this budget pressure just a one-off ad hoc budget pressure just for the next financial year?
Thanks, Councillor Williams. The key thing for us at the moment is obviously we've seen a real change post-pandemic. So we want to really press on with this to make sure there's a huge amount of upfront work. Obviously, we'll need to reevaluate this then at the end of the year, whether or not it's required going forward. But certainly there's a significant pressure at the moment to get those learners back into school.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Councillor Amanda Williams, you content with the reply?
I am, yes, but I just wanted to make it clear as well. Obviously, attendance since COVID, particularly, and you're talking about there the safeguarding of children, there've been a lot more fixed term exclusions down to behaviour, which has impacted on attendance as well. And there's been a lot of safeguarding issues that have stemmed from COVID that have resulted in children being off school, and some of these members of staff that are employed directly by schools are there to deal with those children, not just in certain safeguarding issues, but to bring them into school and make them feel part of the school as well. So that's where I was coming from my question.
Thank you. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Chair. Just really quickly, and I just want to pay credit really to the schools in this regard. Obviously, we deliver services to schools and help them, but every day teachers, support staff who do a fantastic job in our schools. They are supporting learners, and as Councillor Williams has said, we have seen changes in behaviour patterns since the pandemic. And quite frankly, Chair, they're doing an amazing job in schools to support these learners and do the very best to make sure that all their needs are being met. So I agree with you, Councillor Williams, a very positive position for schools, but one that is challenging.
Thank you, Lindsay. We'll now then move to Appendix B, budget reduction proposals on page 41 and EFS 1, that's removal of home to college transport. Councillor Williams?
Apologies, this is my last question, I promise, on this report, because I know I've asked quite a few. Mine was on the three on all of them. And I know it's been touched on before, and Lindsay said about how difficult they are, and that's why they're all red or amber. And it was just to basically, for a committee, to get clarity that what happens if this goes forward and is approved, and yet these targets are not met. What are the consequences of that? Because I know we've looked at the issue of redundancies and returning back to that. You say you'll know more in March. Will March be too late? Because we're making decisions today and going forward in the next couple of in the next month or so. So what happens if we don't achieve these cuts? Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Williams. Lindsay?
Thanks, Chair. Ultimately, with regard to the ones that are directly within my directorate, if they're determined as cuts agreed by council eventually, if they don't go ahead in this area, I need to find them elsewhere. And again, that would be incredibly challenging. They are red. If I cover off the home to college transport one first, much in the same way as you mentioned about nursery previously, obviously post-16 education is non-statutory, and by the very nature of that is the transport associated with it is non-statutory. But again, you know, as I mentioned in the narrative that accompanies it in one of the cells, we talk about there about how important it is for this council, and I'm sure we all agree here, to make sure that learners retained in education, employment or training. And obviously we're doing everything possible to do that. And we see this as being a very important part of it. And again, where we are very lucky in Bridgend, of course, we benefit from an excellent, not just post-16 offer in our sixth forms, but also a very positive offer within Bridgend College as far as further education is concerned. So we're trying our best, Councillor Williams, to make sure that all those learners benefit from as easy as access as possible.
Thank you, Lindsay. Amanda, you contend?
Yes, I am. But
Williams, rather.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I am. But it's also if we say okay, 2% cut to education to schools, and then the schools go into deficit and don't achieve that 2% cut. Like going back to my question before, that money is still got to be found somewhere. It's not just a paper exercise for money. So it is simply what happens if we don't. If schools were unable to then find that 2%. Thanks.
Thanks. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Councillor Williams. It goes back to the question I referred to earlier with regard to the financial scheme for schools. We set out very clearly there the roles of governing bodies and the legal requirements to meet the balanced budget. So again, looking at this is something we seldom never do, but we work with schools to achieve those. Now, if we see at the end of 5 years ultimately where we don't see that, or even during that journey, if we see that the school is not moving in the right direction, we take direct intervention measures then within that school to achieve that. Now, there's a range of issues there within the Schools Cause of Concern guidance that's been published by Welsh Government. I've been a director now for 8 years. I've never employed anything of that nature with regard to Schools Cause of Concern. But again, it is a tool that's available to local authorities, but that would be something that would be the absolute last resort.
Thanks, Lindsay. Councillor Williams, you happy?
Yes, thanks.
Councillor Evans, please.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I think I might have missed a point actually. I want to go back to EFS2 and the additional resources required. I mean, Lindsay, you mentioned earlier that you'd like to think you utilise those organisations and partners to their full potential. And as one of the organisations, we pay just shy of £549,000 a financial year. That organisation is set up of experts in their field, some that have been taken or come from educational setting. Its aim is to raise standards, reduce attainment, and deliver an education system that is a source of national pride and confidence. We also are aware that we have problems in resourcing in education already. My concerns are that questions could be asked, why are we recruiting when we are having to make some extremely difficult decisions to reduce or cut services? It could be perceived as being counterproductive. So, you know, I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Evans. Lindsay, please.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just check, Councillor Evans, is that in reference to Central South Consortium?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Thanks, Councillor Evans. And you raise a fair point, because it does appear contradictory, of course, when you're looking at really experienced, excellent professionals when they're removed from their schools to go and work for another agency. If we look at the improvement partners that we have in Bridgend, part of the offer from Central South, we have 3.6 full-time equivalents as part of that service. All of them are recently retired heads. One of them has just come out of service. Upon Bridgend schools. So again, what we have seen is we've benefited from school improvement services that have been delivered with no service delivery impact on Bridgend. Obviously, it's very important that we get them with recent experience of headship, because that obviously helps us to support heads who are dealing with real issues. So as part of the offer, and you referenced the £550,000 money we pay there, that's a percentage of it. So obviously the 3.6 full-time equivalent improvement partners. But in addition to that, there's a range of services that are provided by our school improvement partners. One is around curriculum development. And as you'll be aware, this year and next year, there's a new curriculum for Wales that's been established. So a significant part of their role is supporting schools on that journey. They also provide support with governor support and governor training, which is obviously helpful. And critically to us, because it is such an important part of what we do in Bridgend, is the development of Welsh language, and we get a lot of support from the Welsh language team there. So a lot of the experience really we do benefit from. Generally, the feedback we have from schools is very, very positive. And to answer the question with regard to how it's impacted with removing colleagues from the classroom, we do have head teachers. I think there's 2 currently from Bridgend primary schools who are being seconded at various stages to support Central South Consortium. But of course, the flip side is that they go out, they see good practice, they absorb it, and then they bring it back to Bridgend. So again, it's a balance, but at the moment, we see this as being a positive deal for the local authority.
Thank you, Lindsay. Councillor Evans, you contend?
Yeah, I've heard. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just one from me. Not sure if this should be EFS 2 or it says EFS 5, I think. It's regarding the Bridge Pupil Referral Unit. Just a simple question, really. Why is it amber?
Thanks, Chair. At a time of writing, we were still trying to work through the operational detail with the PRU. What we're trying to do really is we're trying to look at, instead of the PRU relying on the home to school transport team within the local authority, as Councillor Bundle has alluded to earlier, currently it's down to 2 people. So it's a very, very small team. Even when it's fully populated, it's only 4. And of course, what we're trying to do is to try and give schools in other settings autonomy over their budget and also autonomy over their transport costs. So again, we're working through this to give them the flexibility around that. But obviously, there is benefit to it, because ultimately then is that there's no additional cost outside the agreed envelope to the local authority. So savings and potentially service effectiveness issues as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Lindsay. Are there any further comments from members or registered representatives?
Yes, please, Chair.
Yes, Canon Evans?
Yes, thank you. Yes, someone I raised it earlier. SCH1, efficiency savings against school day electric. Implementation will be a matter for individual schools. It then goes on to say, if efficiency is made solely from staffing budgets, there will be teachers made redundant over the MTFS period. In a sense, perhaps a rhetorical question, but I'm sure we would all agree that staff, both teaching and non-teaching staff in school, bodies in school, are the most important resource that any school has. Are there any suggestions, therefore, as to where the cuts could be made other than staff, teaching, non-teaching? For example, would you suggest cutting the supply budget, or would you suggest reducing heating and lighting in school? What other areas, if you look at perhaps ground maintenance, that is such a small amount of a school budget, it would have minimal effect. I'm just wondering where, other than physical human beings, the resource budget cuts could be made. And I'm just wondering if either the cabinet member or the director would have any suggestions for school, although it's their own responsibility, I know, but if they have any suggestions, I'm sure that would be appreciated. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Canon Evans. Councillor Blundell.
I'll start, and I think and then Lindsay can come in. As Canon Evans raised at the end there, it is up to schools where they make those cuts and governing bodies. Me and the Reverend will be looking at these when we sit down on Brenturian Comprehensive and look for our budget. I don't think it's my place to right now say where people should look at their own budgets, because I'm not addressed with all budgets and with all 59 plus 1 budgets in my head. I'm good, but I'm not that good. But I would say try and look at all areas before staffing. I know governing bodies will do that anyway, but I know that's something we'll do on Brenturian Comprehensive and on Kevin Glass Infants. We are looking at how we can minimise the risk of loss of staff. But obviously those costs would then come onto the borough in the forms of corporate landlords and others. But that's for another hat. But a governing body hat on, we'll have. I think it's up to them, to those governing bodies to make those decisions. But I'm sure the finance team here will happily work with schools and will work with schools to make sure that they set a balanced budget if they require their extra support. Lindsay? Sorry, I'm being chair now. Lindsay?
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Canon Evans. I can certainly, excuse me, give you an update on the discussions I've had to date with head teachers. Now, all of these they've identified as being really challenging. So, for example, some of the things they've looked at doing currently is certain withdrawal from activities, so service level agreements, for example. They've also looked at, and Neil referred to this earlier, with regard to changing the availability of senior leaders to be freed up for important management time and increasing their teaching timetable. We could see there, interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, the withdrawal from certain professional learning opportunities and networking opportunities, and that would obviously increase time in school. The management time being reduced by from senior leaders is obviously challenging, but again, that is certainly something I know some schools have looked at, as Neil indicated earlier. The other things I think they're looking at staff structure. And again, it would relate in staffing savings, is the way the school is configured. And that's particularly important when you look at post-16 settings. I know some schools have already looked at the curriculum offer at post-16 and whether or not there would be a decrease in the number of small option classes. And again, this is something that is difficult, very difficult for our secondary colleagues, because obviously they want to retain a broad and balanced curriculum offer for all of the post-16 learners. But again, they might have to look at this, and inevitably there would be a reduced offer in place. Index is to say that ultimately this could potentially look at staff reduction, and I just want to be very clear in that narrative.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Canon Evans, are you happy with that response?
Yes, thank you. As I say, it was almost a rhetorical question, but I just wanted to explore it. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for your observations. Okay, if there aren't any further questions, I'd like to thank Councillor Blundell, the Corporate Director, Lindsay Harvey, and our invitees who provided fascinating context from the front line as head teachers of both a comprehensive school and a junior school for attending. And you may now leave the meeting so that we can consider our conclusions and recommendations. Thank you very much indeed for your presence today. Just 1 minute while Lindsay hobbles out after his rugby career. Okay, members and registered representatives, that was an interesting discussion. I thought we covered a lot of ground there in the last 2.5 hours. So we'll now move to conclusions and recommendations, and I will hand over to Rachel, who will summarise the key points which we've discussed today.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. So I'm briefly going to go through kind of the key themes that came out today and basically go back to members and ask if there's any recommendations or comments you wish to make. I have picked up a few comments, but it's really in terms of back to you in terms of recommendations. So some of the first discussions were around with obviously the school budget forum on the impact of the 2% and whether it be staffing costs. There was discussion around deficit budgets, for example, and I've got noted a few comments there in relation to future monitoring for scrutiny. Certainly, schools going into the deficit as a result of this cut, I think that's key for scrutiny really to monitor. But I think in terms of monitoring these budget reductions, that will become apparent for the committee and their forward work programme. Same again with the mention of the senior managers needing to possibly go back into the classrooms where that's causing an impact on schools. And again, this is in comparison to redundancies then. So really, you're looking at the impact of this 2% as a possible monitoring item in the future, or the impact of any potential cut, to be fair, whatever is determined by Cabinet. But those are a few items. Following on from that then, there was a discussion about free school meals, and I've got a few comments in there in terms of future, getting exact figures from Lindsay in terms of funding. I've also got in terms of the concern implementation of the free school meals agenda, and obviously it's not just about getting catering staff in and getting that all sorted. Is that just not equipment and kitchen? It's actually the space for the children to have this and for it to be implemented effectively. Not sure whether there's any comments or recommendations further that members wish to make on that, but I've noted the concerns definitely, and the impact potentially on budget, obviously, because whilst this has to be implemented, there's no budget line to implement that if there is anything needed. There was discussion around energy uplifts then. There was also discussion around housing developments and the impact that this would have in terms of the sizes of schools. There was mention of the Section 106 funding for this, but I know there was a lot of concern from the committee about how those numbers are used and about the current numbers being used where the developments then get bigger and them being suitable. There was mention as well of the use of PAN numbers and whether members wanted to make any comments in relation to that and how they're used. Excuse me. Following on from that, then there was mention of the delivery risk. Obviously, that a lot of the funding, the reductions that are proposed for education are actually read, including the 2% put forward. The corporate director did respond in relation to this, but if you have any further recommendations you want to make on that, I've noted the concerns, obviously, but if there's any recommendations, please let me know. Similarly, in relation to the overspend, concerns over the overspend for this year and the impact that that will have. Lindsay did come back and say about this was to do with ALN staffing vacancies, homeschool transport and cost of inflation for food and catering, for example, and corporate health and safety. But obviously, in terms of the impact then over those continuing next year, and schools then resulting obviously in a deficit and it marrying up. There was then mention of council tax and consultation, and members were discussing about how the consultation is, or how the actual impact of the decision on council tax is portrayed to the public. And I know this is aspects that have been picked up in other committees as well. Policy changes were identified both here and then later on as well, just in the recent question by the Reverend Karen Evans as well as the Chair, in relation to whether the local authority need to be stronger in terms of more policy changes over discretionary services. And this, I think there's a few questions relating to that and a few areas where this came up again. So again, I'm not sure whether members wish to make any recommendations in relation to discretionary services going forward, particularly because it links in obviously with the one budget proposal going forward to homeschool transport, but there was mention of that. On this as well, obviously, I would like to ask members' views, and obviously we haven't discussed the social services, and I know it's not part of your remit, but it is maybe necessary for you to form comments on it in relation to the budget, in relation to the protection on social services, and then also obviously the budget growths going forward for them, because that's kind of the pressure that's then being put on other directorates, like the Education Directorate, to then make something like the proposed 2% cut So maybe if members could form some views on that. I know it said there hasn't been discussion, but maybe it would be useful to take that forward to Cabinet. Homeschool transport, as I've said, came into quite a lot of it in terms of the discretionary services and the potential. And there was mention, I've noted a review possibly on homeschool transport that the Cabinet member mentioned, so I thought that could put forward on the forward work programme. I think I've covered everything. So as I said, I've got lots of concerns and comments, but nothing really in relation to a recommendation. But obviously it's for the committee to now decide in terms of their views on the various aspects and what recommendations you would like to form, please.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that comprehensive overview of 2 hours and 45 minutes worth of discussion. Amazing job to pull that together in such a concise way. Thank you for summarising it so well. I'll hand over to members now to make any conclusions and recommendations which they would like Cabinet to consider. Please raise your hand if you have any conclusions and recommendations which we can submit. Councillor Evans.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I would like to them to just consider whether we, are utilising our organisation and partners to its full potential. We should know if we're actually utilising them to their full potential, and not like to think we are. So, that is something that we need to be looking at. If we are paying an organisation or being part of an organisation, we need to know that actually we are using them to the full potential.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Councillor Evans. I'll bring in Rachel now.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I was just going to mention, Councillor Evans, that actually a good opportunity for this committee to really get to grips with this, if we're in relation to the Central South Consortium, is you have an annual report of the Central South Consortium coming to you in March. So that would be a good opportunity to really see in terms of value for money type aspect.
Thanks, Rachel. Councillor Evans, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, I fully appreciate that, but obviously I was not given that information before we have to make these decisions today. To know that information before we make any decision in order for us to be informed correctly.
Perhaps a catch-all recommendation would be to ensure that the local authority collaborates with our partners and ensures value for money. Perhaps that can be one of the recommendations going forward for the medium-term financial strategy period.
Thank you.
I think that captures the kind of thing that you wanted to portray, wasn't it, Councillor Evans? Councillor Winstanley, please.
Hi. So I thought that it was really interesting with, for example, the questions on the staffing budget. There was no real thought as to whether or not the use of agency staff and whether that's excessive or not, and whether there could be a more cohesive approach across the whole of the county for having people who cover short-term sickness, for example, and absences like that. I'm sure that we could do something with that. I liked I think also, I'm sure you've picked up on that we need to do some work on catchment areas, home to school transport, home to college transport, and pupil admission numbers. And I'm sure that will be part of your recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Winstanley. Have you captured that, Rachel?
Mm-hmm.
Please, if there's any dissent, by the way, please, not necessarily against Councillor Winstanley's recommendation, but if there's any dissent, please let me know, because these are recommendations of the whole committee. So we need to ensure that they are unanimous. Canon Evans, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just to go back to Councillor Evans's point about Central South. These are questions which I've been asking for very many years of Council. I was a member of the Budget Forum for a long time, and every time the contribution to CSE was mentioned, I would ask the question as to what value they were providing, all sorts of questions. Never really had a satisfactory answer from anybody, excuse me, except to say that on one occasion, Councillor Charles Smith did agree with everything I was saying, and that the best resources the schools ever had were subject advisors, which of course we no longer have with Central South. So there is a whole area that needs to be explored there once again, as to what Central South really is doing for the schools in this borough. That's really just I wanted to add what Councillor Evans was saying.
Thank you very much for that contribution. You've achieved more than I have in that Councillor Charles Smith has agreed with something you said. I don't think he's ever agreed with anything that I've said. Anyway, moving on. Is there anyone else that'd like to contribute? I can add something if you like, Rachel. From my perspective, members, given the fact that our representatives from the School Budget Forum expressed grave concerns about the 2% budget reduction in schools' delegated budgets, it would be remiss of us not to reflect that in our recommendations. We ought to ask Cabinet to review this proposal, given the fact that the budget reduction proposals have a high risk delivery factor, or status rather, and that the budget proposals have not been fully developed. Therefore, I would recommend that the committee asks Cabinet to reduce the proposed budget reduction proposals to, I would say, 1%, acknowledging the fact that education needs to play its role in balancing the budget, but noting the fact that the School Budget Forum representatives expressed grave concern that the 2% budget reduction proposals were not feasible. Furthermore, as I've mentioned previously in another forum and here today, I feel that there ought to be greater consideration of, and I support Councillor Evans's view, that we should ensure that the delivery of our statutory services is of paramount importance. Not to say that discretionary services do not have their role. However, we should, Cabinet should consider all discretionary options available to them for budget reduction proposals, and that they be presented to full council for their consideration as part of their consideration of the budget going forward. Furthermore, I know this was considered yesterday, but there's no harm in adding weight to it from this committee to ensure that all national legislative commitments are fully funded. Third, I feel that we ought to make reference to what Councillor Tim Thomas and others have said regarding the protection of vulnerable children, ALNCOs, that's additional learning needs coordinators, and safeguarding staff. Fourth, I feel that we ought to reflect comments on the recruitment and retention of teaching staff, and our concern that 2% budget reductions might have an effect on compulsory redundancies. And I think I have reflected all of my recommendations in those remarks, but please do come in if you disagree with what I've said regarding, particularly regarding the suggestion that they reduce their 2% budget cuts by half, and that's 1%, and that they ought to look at other areas across the corporate-wide budgets and other directorates to compensate for that to balance the budget. Councillor Williams.
Thanks very much. Apologies, I have to go onto my phone now. I agree with everything you've said. I'd like to see as a recommendation, they said they were looking at the funding for new bills, because new bills have always had to struggle because they don't get to a balanced, they aren't able to balance their budgets on classrooms until they get to a certain size, which is something like 28 children in the class of 30. So I'd like to see that come back to us. And I would also like to have more, because Lindsay said in March, you won't know till March the impact on redundancies. Well, that's too late, because we could end up paying more in redundancy package settlements than a 2% cut. So I think that's important, that we need to look at it. And I agree with everything you've said, because I have concerns that if you're removing staff, and it won't be the teachers, because you still have to have a teacher in the class, it'll be the support staff who are supporting the most vulnerable and those with additional learning needs. It'll be the ones who come in to offer interventions, and it'll be those staff that which will in money having to be spent elsewhere or further down the line via social services or somewhere else to pick up the pieces for those children that we've let down. So that's all I've got to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Williams. Are there any other comments or conclusions or recommendations? First, Councillor Winstanley.
Hi, I'd just like to say I agree with him.
We've lost you, Councillor Winstanley, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'll say that again. I quite agree with Councillor Amanda Williams's points about the staffing. I'm quite concerned also that the offer of redundancy would be a very expensive offer, and that we would lose lots of very committed and experienced teachers with a lot of experience. And I'd also not want to see that loss with those learning support assistants who are so essential for children who've got particular needs to be supported.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Councillor Llewellyn-Hopkins.
I'd just like to say that being a teacher myself, I know how invaluable support staff are, and I don't think that some schools can afford to lose really good members of staff who know the kids in some cases much better than the teachers do, because they spend so much more time with them. Where we might have them 3 lessons a week, they're with them 20 lessons a week. So I am really concerned about the 2%, I'll be honest with you, really concerned.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. We have to be pragmatic in realising that education has been protected for time in memoriam since I've been on the council, but they do have to make a contribution because of the difficult situation we're in. But it was very clear from the School Budget Forum representatives and us as members that we felt that 2% was not a feasible budget reduction proposal as part of this budget round, and that more work needs to be done to develop these budget reduction proposals. So yeah, thank you very much for that. I couldn't agree with you more. Are there any other contributions from members? Rachel would like to come in as well.
Thank you, Chair. Just on 1 or 2 points. Firstly, I was just going to check whether anyone did have any opposing to any of those recommendations, particularly on the 2% to 1%. Please, can members state it? The other thing then I was going to ask is, I'm playing devil's advocate here. We will be asked as a scrutiny committee, if you don't want to make the 2%, where do you propose it comes to? And I know the chair has stated that without the detail in terms of the full budget book and where the impact of potential cuts on other services is the issue, and we don't have that today. However, I'm just raising what the Cabinet Member for Resources said, and he said potentially if you don't want to cut that, then you increase council tax. So I'm just wondering if there's any views, or likewise, we've similarly spoke about looking at discretionary services. So is that where you want to link it in terms of looking at more the discretionary side, or would you like to say about revisiting council tax? Is there anything? Because I know the officers will come back and the Cabinet Member and ask, where does the committee propose we get these savings from then? Or likewise, similarly, not put the social services budget pressures forward that are presented. As I said, I know social services isn't within your remit, but you're perfectly entitled to say, we don't agree with putting these pressures forward at the expense of education being cut, for example.
Thanks, Rachel. Councillor Llewellyn-Hopkins, please.
With regards to the increase in council tax, again, I've got serious concerns. My ward, my ward have already expressed to me how much they're being squeezed at the minute with the cost of living. And I don't know how we ask somebody who's already been squeezed to the limit to give us more money. I don't have a solution to where we get the money from, but I think we do need to revisit things.
Thank you for that contribution. Councillor Williams?
I agree. I think it's a lot of families are being impacted at the moment. Families that we don't see. It's not just our poorer. It is working families who are struggling to make ends meet. But and like I said, if we remove the support staff, which is where the cuts will come from in schools, we will end up with more of the pressures being faced by social services. But it's difficult for us because, yes, I was on COSC, but I wasn't able to ask on COSC my questions on communities because we were looking at the overall Chief Executive's Directorate. I'm not on COSC, so I don't know some of the answers from these other directorates. I'm on social services, so I will have a better understanding tomorrow. But I'm not on the community, so community scrutiny, sorry. And so I won't have that element of information to be able to make this decision. So we're asking this now, but we don't really have all the facts, because there might be a perfectly good discussion in the communities one where they might decide, well, actually, this could be cut or this could be, but we don't know because we're not part of those committees.
Well, thanks for that, Councillor Williams. As part of the next corporate overview and scrutiny committee, we will receive all of the conclusions and recommendations from all three scrutiny committees. So hopefully we can review the recommendations at that point and come to a conclusion. But you're absolutely right, we don't have sufficient information. That was rehearsed yesterday in corporate overview and scrutiny committee, and I hope that will be addressed in future. But to address Rachel's point directly, the Cabinet will simply come back to us and say, where are we going to find the money if we reduce the Education Directorate's contribution to the budget reduction proposals from 2% to 1%. That is effectively £1.something million, 1.1 million, I think, isn't it, off the top of my head. We therefore have to look at our discretionary services, in my view, and therefore we must not, for want of a better word, we have no option but to look at where we gold plate some of our services, such as home to school transport and nursery level provision, to ensure that we can meet our statutory obligations and protect our schools' delegated budgets to a certain extent. So therefore, perhaps a recommendation could be that we undertake a consultation on discretionary services within the Education Directorate to evaluate the costs of delivering discretionary services and the value which they provide to the local authority and its residents. So, Councillor, where are we? Councillor Llewellyn Hopkins, have you already spoken, or you would like to intervene again?
It's a legacy hand, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, no problem at all. Councillor Evans.
Yeah, I do agree with everything that has been actually said. However, in order to make informed decisions going forward, we do need to understand, to make a true representation of where we believe cuts should happen if we have all the information. So I would really recommend that actually, you know, the 1st of March, we have budget meetings, and yet I'm not going to understand whether certain organisations, they don't publish their report until then. So, you know, we do need to look at, I think, discretionary areas.